Yes. So now we'll be starting the conference with Ruchi.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Am I audible, visible?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I, Ruchi Nagpal, on behalf of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, welcome you all to the 2 days international conference on pandemic titled Panoramas of the Pandemic, Literary and Cultural Responses. I was asked to introduce the conference, and as I sat down, mulling over the idea and the very word pandemic, the two things that flashed through my mind as an immediate response to the word pandemic were fear and pain. Year 2020, the year which heralded this pandemic into our lives, and the year 2021, when it reached its pinnacle worldwide, these 2 years shook mankind to its core. The intensity with which it hit every individual, every sector, and every part of the globe was unprecedented. Year 2020 was definitely a year of fear. Locked inside our homes, uncertain about future, people struggled with their emotions and their response to what was happening. In 2021, as the pandemic surged, sometime after mid-April, it was more devastating and fatal, taking lives by the minute. Pain is the only feeling one could recall from that period. Pain of losing a loved one, a dear friend, a colleague, and the collective pain of humanity grieving and mourning for all the lives lost to the pandemic. Government tried as much as they could to curtail the situation by imposing strict lockdowns, but tragedy ensued despite all. One cannot forget the social media platforms being flooded with SOS messages, and as the days rolled by, we watched the world seeping deeper and deeper into the abyss, shrouding hope and even truth at times. Despite government trying to suppress the horror that this pandemic unleashed, this photograph of crematorium piled up with piles of burning corpses made the front page of all the leading newspapers. This was pandemic. As Arundhati Roy wrote in her article, Pandemic is a Portal, people will fall sick and die at home. We may never know their stories. They may not even become statistics. And we experienced all this in those 2 years, the pain and the fear. But today, I'm glad that we are talking about this pandemic in retrospect as something which was not a bygone thing, definitely, but the intensity has subdued greatly, allowing us to embrace physical space like before. And this has happened as a result of the joint efforts of people who came together from all walks of life, answering the call of humanity, like Zizek observed. Such a universal threat gives birth to global solidarity. Our petty differences become insignificant. We all work together to find a solution. Healthcare sector in every nation worked round the clock, looking for an antidote, and they did succeed, with inoculation drives taking off in every nation. Our conference today is an attempt to assess the literary and cultural landscape after the pandemic, like people come out of their homes after a thunderstorm and assess their surroundings. Our conference, therefore, is an attempt to look at the response of the literary and cultural world to the pandemic. It's an attempt to look at the rapid and irreversible changes triggered by the pandemic, such as the increase in the pace of digital transformation, deepening of global food insecurity, and waves of mental health issues. These things triggered the new normal world over. Stories of creativity, caring, and coping dotted the literary horizon, and important critical works such as Arundhati Roy's Pandemic is a Portal and Slavoj Žižek's Pandemic COVID-19 Shakes the World raised an alarm at the potential structural changes that this pandemic precipitated. The binaries of personal experiences hinged on narratives of survival, hope, and kindness on one hand, and death, morbidity, and brutality on the other, especially ones that were shared on social media, sparked new ways of understanding lived realities. This conference envisions such lived realities of the pandemic and post pandemic times in order to paint a panoramic picture of these unprecedented moments. Spread over 2 days, our conference is divided into 9 sessions. 6 sessions where we have paper presentations have been thematically structured with sessions titled Punctuating the Pandemic, Literature and Confinement, Pandemic Panoramas, Art in the Time of Contagion, Performing the Pandemic from the Audiovisual to the Pedagogic, Philosophizing the Pandemic, Affect, Critique and Language, Picturing the Pandemic, Graphic, Games and Memes, and Personalizing the Pandemic, Ethnography of the Self and the Other. The 3 keynote sessions will have Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury, Dr. Justin Weinberg, and Professor James S. Comlin. Our inaugural keynote address, which we'll have in a short while, will be delivered by Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury on how to create a panoramic anthropology instead of an anthropomorphic one, an exercise in the historical intelligence of a pandemic situation. Our second keynote today, which is from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m., would be delivered by Dr. Justin Weinberg, who would be talking about the ethics of distinction. And our valedictory keynote address would be delivered by Professor James S. Baumman tomorrow from 7:30 to 8:30 on the topic Teaching Pandemics, What We Have Yet to Learn or Are Unwilling to Admit. With that, I once again welcome you all to our conference, Panoramas of the Pandemic, Literary and Cultural Response, and I hope will be worthy of your time and interest. I now take a back seat, but before I do that, I would like to invite Professor Simi Malhotra, Head, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and the major driving force behind all of this, to please come and deliver the welcome address.
Thank you so much, Ruchi. Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury, our keynote speaker here, and all others who have joined us from different universities, and of course, all the scholars who are here. I, on behalf of actually Stephen, Ruchi, and Sananda, as someone who actually should take a much more backseat than Ruchi, because this is really their conference, welcome you all on behalf of the department. And I welcome all the scholars of the department who've been so actively participating in putting this together. But I doff my hat off to Stephen and to Ruchi and to Sananda for not only conceiving the conference, but inviting such a huge barrage of abstracts from which it was very difficult to select the participants who are here. And then, of course, contacting all the keynote speakers who've been so gracious and kind and have decided to be with us. And of course, I'm most grateful to Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury. I mean, a cult figure from JNU, I mean, someone we've looked up to and admired for so many years and decades, who's agreed to be here. So I'm not really going to stand between them, but I really want to thank my scholars, Stephen, Ruchi, and Sananda, for this absolutely wonderful treat which they are going to offer you for the next 2 days. I'm sure we've all grappled with the pandemic in our own ways, and I think this will really be an occasion for all of us to talk together. And so welcome everybody on behalf of the department. I'm sure it's going to be a treat, but I won't stand between you and the keynote speaker who's with us, and I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you guys have a great time. I'm pretty sure you will. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We shall now start with our inaugural keynote address, which will be delivered by Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury, who has joined us. This session will be moderated by Aditi Das Khan, who is a research scholar in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. The session would be chaired by Professor Simi Malhotra and Stephen S. George. Stephen is a Ph.D. research scholar in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Professor Simi Malhotra is professor and head, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Her areas of interest include literary theory and popular cultural studies. Her latest publications are the co-authored books Terrains of Consciousness, Multilogical Perspective on Globalization by Würzburg University Press 2021, and Ocean as Method, Thinking with the Maritime by Routledge 2022, and the co-edited books Food Culture Studies in India, Consumption, Representation, and Mediation, and Inhabiting Cyberspace in India, Theory, Perspectives, and Challenges, both from Springer in 2021. I welcome both the chairs and request them to take over and introduce the keynote speaker.
Thank you so much, Ruchi. I mean, it is my total privilege to chair this session, and now I will directly introduce the speaker, Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury, with you. It is my complete pleasure and privilege to introduce to you one of the most accomplished contemporary philosophers from the global South, Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury. He is an associate professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has authored Theatre Number Event, 3 studies on the relationship between sovereignty, power, and truth. He has written articles on ancient Greek liturgy, the staging of Ibsen, psychoanalysis, Nietzsche, Schiller, and Hegel. His latest book is Now It's Come to Distances, Notes on Coronavirus and Shaheen Bagh, Association and Isolation. Now, over to you, Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury, for the inaugural keynote address.
Confirm this? All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I am very pleased to be here to talk to all of you. I really thank the organizers, Simi, of course, for hosting me here and saying very nice things. And I have no way of living up to them, but I'll say what I have to say. And first of all, I am really happy that you're doing this because this is something which, in a way, it signals a kind of new phase of things when we can speak about the pandemic in terms which are not the usual terms, which are usually related to medical and policy-related governmental terms of, reference. Instead of that, if one speaks of the pandemic through a more, how should I put it, artistic and creative and eventually kind of intellectual, through an intellectual medium, that itself shows that we are moving to a new threshold of our experience in relation to the pandemic. At the same time, it is not sure that we can simply say that we have crossed the pandemic situation or that pandemic passage. So it's in that sort of a slightly uncertain and yet very sort of a specific moment that you all of you plan to do, or you actually decide to do this conference. Seems to me to be something very, very interesting. And that is the point that I'd like to really raise here, that is the pandemic interesting? I mean, the pandemic is serious, it is terrible, it is real, but is it interesting? That is really the question for me that I has guided me through the last few years and even now. But before any of that, I have an apology to tender to all of you. The title that I announced has a kind of error in it. It's apparently a small error, but it's a significant error. When for some reason, I don't know what happened, when I put down the title as anthropomorphic, non-anthropomorphic anthropology, what I meant to write was non-anthropocentric anthropology. How to not create, or how to create an anthropology which is panoramic. And that idea comes to me from an excellent concept note, instead of an anthropocentric one. For some reason, every time I'm meant to say or write anthropocentric, it became anthropomorphic. That is a mistake. And now, of course, the question of an anthropomorphic representation of human society is absolutely something that I want to address. But that's only at the level of representation. What I fundamentally want to indicate is a problem of the very structure of a certain anthropology, which is almost tautologically, it seems, anthropocentric, human-centric. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So yes, first of all, I have to make that apology. Now, the question that really incites me and has incited me to even write a book about it is the pandemic interesting? Because you see, every time we speak of the pandemic, we tend to speak of it in terms of a certain kind of reduction, a necessary reduction of our rich social and creative and every other kind of life to what we call um, biological life, a life which is really to be evaluated or diagnosed or treated in medical terms. So is it possible to really find a medicalized or medically reduced life interesting? Insofar as interesting already connotes or is associated with something which is not monotonous, which has some variation, some nuance, you know, some, well, if you want, from your excellent concept note, something which is panoramic, which means several perspectives, several visual snapshots. Instead of that, to speak of purely biological life or a medicalized life seems, at least on the face of it, very important, very serious, unavoidable, but not interesting. And yet, it is true that not just in this pandemic, but in all the pandemics of the past and the history of the plague from all over the world, we have really got a wealth of literary, artistic, and other sorts of, well, again, for a broader term, one could say intellectual responses. It has incited a really vigorous intellectual response in the history of pandemics and plagues. So while that is a fact, suppose we were to limit ourselves to this experience of the COVID-19 from 2020 onwards, this experience, what we encountered from the very beginning was a kind of declaration of the epidemic that arose in a certain part of the world, which transformed the epidemic into a pandemic situation, a global pandemic situation. And that declaration took place only because we were already living in a globalized world, which is regulated and in a way, it is globalized by institutions, including institutions of global health. The example here is, of course, the World Health Organization. So it is only because of the existence of an organization like that, which declared the epidemic to be a pandemic very early on, which is very unusual for an epidemic which spreads in different sort of spaces and at different rates of spreading across the world. But in this case, because of the nature of our already globalized world, the pandemic declaration took place very early on in the history of the COVID-19 spread. And to that extent, the pandemic situation was officially declared and instituted through really an act of language. We must not forget that. So we are involved with language from the very beginning of our history of the pandemic. While it is true that we were reduced or necessarily to be completely enclosed within our biological lives through a medical abstraction, which is biological life is a medical abstraction. This abstraction itself worked as a particular public health situation, which is the pandemic situation, as a historical situation. The meaning of that situation as a pandemic situation was made possible only because of our globalized world and the nature of such global institutions as the World Health Organization. And the procedure of that institution was linguistic, insofar as at a certain point, very early on in 2020, the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros, he actually declared in a classic act, which is a performative act, a speech act, that the epidemic situation is now a pandemic situation, which means it covers, at least, in tendency, the whole world. So we are involved in acts of language, in acts of discourse, in acts of meaning from the very beginning of this pandemic. But this itself does not make it interesting, because in itself it's still functional. It just creates a particular public health, situation, and whatever awareness that requires at the national and international levels. What makes the pandemic interesting, and that became evident from the very beginning, is what makes it so tragic, which is not simply the medical emergency that the pandemic is and was, but what through the pandemic was revealed to be the nature of this globalized world, and that nature was a contradictory nature. So what happened was, and you all know this, that with the pandemic and its declaration and this sort of global awareness of its danger and its contagion, its spread, all kinds of governmental and state measures were taken, including in India, of course, and that brought out not so much a unilinear causality that by taking those measures, we can now, partly at least fight the pandemic and judge how far are we able to prevent the pandemic from spreading and so on and so forth. But instead of that, what we saw was a whole series of collateral contradictory effects, the most obvious of which and graphic of which and distressing of which, tragic of which, is what happened with the migrant population all over the world, but particularly in our own immediate experience in India. That is not something I want to talk about today, but I have written about it. But what is important is that it is part of this very exposure of the nature of globalization, which is a nature traversed by crucial and violent contradictions. In that sense, the pandemic situation was not simply a biological abstraction or simply to be reduced to a biological abstraction, which is that all of us, all human beings, were to be thought of now as purely, creaturely, as biological. But instead of that, what we found emerging in the historicity of the pandemic situation was a world which is fundamentally divided along contradictory class lines, gender lines, and other kinds of fault lines. Methodologically, this is what I call the historical intelligence that a situation, particularly in this case, the pandemic situation, really it is a demand that the situation makes that we extract its historical intelligence, which basically means that the historical intelligence which is able to, instead of simply going by the biological reduction of the situation or the biological abstraction that the situation apparently, it compels us to perform that abstraction. Instead of that, while that is all happening, instead of that, we really focus on what happens when this abstraction gets entangled or clashes with real social contradictions, social and economic contradictions on a global scale. This requires a method that I call the method of extracting the historical intelligence of a situation. Instead of simply going by a theoretical or a declarative or even, a scientific framework, which makes it seem as if the situation has only one and a monotonous dimension. Though, of course, an absolutely essential dimension, which is the dimension of, in the pandemic situation, fed to life, fed to human life, all human life, which is absolutely true and essential. But in itself, it does not make the situation interesting. What makes it interesting is that while this abstraction does indeed pertain to what is going on with us, it addresses our reality, it is entangled with something else, which is the structure of that very world which is under threat. And that structure is a contradictory structure. And it is through this sort of a contradiction or the exposure of contradictions that the situation becomes more complicated, more interesting, and indeed more tragic. So when, methodologically speaking, when I wrote my book, which you mentioned very kindly, it was from within this particular structure of understanding in relation to the pandemic. So today, so anyway, to complete the picture, so the exercise of a historical intelligence of the pandemic situation, when I was writing my book in 2021, at that time, it simply finally sort of prompted me and almost compelled me to name the structure, this contradictory structure of the global world. And that name is a well-known name, though I think that name is mostly discouraged, or it is disavowed, it's suppressed, because the name seems to be so obvious that if you mention it, then either it seems simply something which is common sense and doesn't have to be talked about, or it creates what we could call a political. It creates a particular kind of political exigence or a kind of political demand. And what is the demand? That the situation be changed, the structure of this global arrangement of the world be changed. And that word, which either is simply commonsensical as a descriptive word, or is an extremely loaded, even dangerous political word, is that the world is capitalist, or the world is dominated by capitalist social relations. So I said that historical intelligence in the pandemic situation actually makes us see this particular oscillation, this sort of movement from one pole to the other, of the pandemic speaking from within capitalism and capitalism speaking from within the pandemic. It was in this context that the first exercise in sort of a historical intelligence of the pandemic situation I performed in the early part of this experience. Today, what I want to talk to you about is something which is a further task and another task related, of course, in relation to the historical intelligence in the pandemic situation. Another dimension of that particular historical intelligence that we need to extract and name. And that is what I call the historical intelligence of a certain anthropological impulse, or an anthropological sort of a puzzle that this situation brings up. So this can be illustrated with the example of the question of immunity and immunization. So we know that once the shock of the pandemic sort of hit the world, and everything went to, everything was fragmented and splintered in terms of both the everyday life of ordinary, human existence, but also at the level of something which I think is a very important thing, particularly in Europe, which is a kind of intellectual shock. And how is it possible for us, who seem to have reached a level of a certain kind of development, a certain kind of progress, not just in economic terms, but in terms of social consciousness, in terms of actual forms of life, which, for instance, involve a certain kind of life expectancy, a certain kind of happiness, in society that is expected of all members of society, of the developed world in particular, the West and in Europe. That world meets a really rude shock when they find that they are suddenly confronted with the real specter of death. So on the one hand, the old population in Italy starts dying, and the paradox is that there is an old population there precisely because the state of health is so good till then that we have a large number of old people who live well, like I said, healthily and happily, apparently. And they start dying because you're confronted with a new specter of death, a new agent of death, which is virus. And that is not simply a physical threat, obviously it is, but it is an intellectual shock. How does one conceptualize our world anymore when this kind of uh, historical contradiction happens, that we are suddenly a society which has reached a threshold of apparently irreversible historical development of our health, of our social situation, and so on and so forth, are suddenly brought back to a kind of anthropological confrontation with the question of human life in conflict or as threatened by another kind of species, a non-human agent of death. So there's this sort of intellectual shock. There's also an anthropological shock, particularly felt in Western European societies, Western, and particularly it started in Italy, so in European society. Once we keep this in mind, in the first phase, we can then observe that as we go along in the next few months and within a year, all nations, the developed as well as the developing, and well, that's a different discussion. It's a very serious discussion about the terribly varying states of medical research with regard to question of vaccination and immunization. Whatever that might be, the question of immunization and immunity arises almost immediately after the first shock is felt. And it is then that a further anthropological puzzle is evident, or it bewilders us. And that puzzle is that on the one hand, a virus does not exclusively attack or involve the human species merely. It, and including the coronavirus, it actually is a virus like other viruses, which insinuates itself and affects other species. With the coronavirus, it's a question of pangolin and bats and so on and so forth. All of these species have an immunity response to the virus. But it is only with the human species that the question of immunization can take place. But immunization takes place at a level which is not merely that of the biological species response to another species which it encounters, but it is at the level of something which is intrahuman, which involves putting a particular value on human life. This life, which is so-called the life peculiar to the species, human species life, is also a valued life. Sometimes it can be expressed in religious terms, that life is sacred, and sometimes, of course, it can be expressed in economic terms, that life is utilizable. Life is valuable in literal terms, that it can be utilized. Whatever that might be, we see that life, at the human level, already gains a somewhat different meaning from simply species life. We don't have the time to go into this, but one of the essential references here is Karl Marx, who in his 1840s work is already speaking of human species life, a species being, but which is not simply biological life, but which is already something like historical and social. So it is in the human species that you find an entanglement of the biological abstraction of life or species life and something which is far more concrete and far more uncertain, and with a lot of change that happens to it, which is historical life. So Marx is writing about this in economic and philosophical manuscripts. He's talking about it in his response to Feuerbach, in Thesis on Feuerbach, and so on and so forth. All of this is already happening in the 19th century. And along with Marx, a little after that in Europe, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, speaks of this strange kind of what he calls stupidity of human beings, that they think themselves as superior to the other species because for some reason they think their lives are worth protecting instead of, thinking of themselves as simply part of the web of life, web of natural life. They think of themselves as anthropologically destined to survive and no one else might survive. So in that sense, it is something which makes human beings strangely self-exceptionalizing. But at the same time, it is stupid because human beings also put up a kind of argument of victimhood, that they are the weakest of all species, or they are one of the weakest species. So they're both weak and special. They're both weak and vulnerable, and at the same time, they put an exceptional value on their own. This Nietzsche calls a kind of prudence which is on the side of stupidity. In contrast to that, he speaks of a kind of historical intelligence or a historical philosophical intelligence, which is able to see this strange duality and this strange sort of ambiguity in the anthropological triumphalism that he claimed for themselves, while at the same time absolutely putting up an argument for victimhood and weakness in the web of species life and natural life. So, like Marx, Nietzsche is also speaking of a certain contradiction in the anthropological claim, though from a different angle, of course. This becomes very clear, when we look at the immunization question in the present situation. Immunization takes place only with putting a particular value on human life, which is exceptional. But the question of immunity is immediately confronted and felt by human beings as part of their inextricable linkage to other forms of life. That is why, biologists raise the question that why is it that bats have a lesser intense immunity response than human beings to the same viral threat and attack of the coronavirus? So in that sense, immunity can never be species-centric. Immunity must already be something coming from the larger web of natural life, which is not simply part of animal life, which can extend up to a larger ecological life, a life which includes non-human to non-animal life. In that sense, the widest idea of nature. But at the same time, the anthropological exceptionalism cannot be avoided entirely because otherwise there is no way that human beings can make themselves the subject of a historical situation, which then makes them want to do everything that we frantically tried to do over the last 2 or 3 years, which is to conduct scientific research at an express speed and do things that are also very uncertain in terms of announcing results of vaccine tests and so on, and eventually get the vaccine into operation and so on and so forth. All of this can be only possible. This absolute sense of urgency can only be possible with a certain anthropological exceptions. So this is what I call the new task for a historical intelligence to grasp this strange contradictory or equivocal relationship between, on the one hand, this anthropological purposive exceptionalism that human beings can give themselves a purpose, which is to save themselves, and at the same time they cannot but recognize that their lives are inextricably interconnected with all of nature. And if you do not recognize that, then you already, in a sense, are committing a kind of, species suicide, which climate change is a kind of, clear example of. That a certain long species suicide has been continuously being committed for at least the 200 to 300 years since the Industrial Revolution. And yet, we cannot completely escape the anthropological condition either. This comes to the fore which then takes me to the further point that is it possible to think of an anthropology, even create an anthropology which is not anthropocentric, which does not fall into the temptation of an anthropological exception, and yet which does not entirely dissolve the question of anthropology into a general ecology, or even a general theology, because you see, theology has already, in a sense, said that it is not difficult to overcome human-centric thinking or an anthropology by simply, Christianity does it very clearly, by simply saying that human life is only transient life towards another life, which is a kind of superior, immaculate life, a resurrected life. So by that logic, a theology and an ecology are the two poles within which the question of anthropology has to be raised. Both theology is one proposal for overcoming the anthropological exigency or its sort of unavoidability, and the other way is to completely submerge or even dissolve anthropology into a general ecology or a general naturalism, a philosophy of nature, whatever you want to call it. But with the reality of the pandemic situation and its historical intelligence that it sort of, provides, it is not simple or even prudent or even justifiable to do either, to move towards a theology or simply to resort to a general ecosophy or ecology without confronting the anthropological problem or its impasse. So how does one now think of this sort of an, if at all it's thinkable, of this non-anthropocentric anthropology? This is really the question I ask. And this question I ask not because I have the answer for it, but because it is an interesting question. And in a way, this is the kind of question that indeed makes the pandemic situation an interesting situation without taking away any of its terrible its reality and its violence. So along these lines, I would like to now briefly talk about a certain, for examples, a certain, well, again taking your metaphor, a certain panoramic snapshots, or word that you use in your concept, a very nice word, excerpts, provides certain panoramic excerpts, which might give us some leads, some clues on how to answer the question of non-anthropocentric anthropology. You see, in after the pandemic became a worldwide reality, within the first 1 year, particularly in Europe, this doesn't happen so much in the South, in what we call the global South. And why it does not happen is something we can discuss. But in Europe, in the West, there is indeed a very strong and a very intense intellectual response to one of the documents that brings together a lot of these responses in Europe is a certain issue of the journal called Critique and Crisis, and edited by Frank Ruda and someone else. And in that journal, with a lot of articles, we have one article which I'd like to refer to by the French philosopher Catherine Malabou, who speaks in a very strange way about the pandemic. And she doesn't use the word pandemic so much as use the older word, a more evocative word, contagion. And contagion is already a word which has a particular social meaning and a biological meaning of infection, but a social meaning of something which is very close to the caste reality in India, of something which creates a situation of separation, segregation, and untouchability, or a fear of the touch. So it's a sensory image that she uses. She calls it contagion. And she says, in essence, that with a contagion, unlike our, again, our commonsensical sort of consensual understanding, which could also be an example of what I've called Sunichi, an example of a certain stupidity on whose side prudence is. So in that sense, you have to be a bit stupid to be prudent, strangely. But at the same time, you can only be stupid as well as prudent when you do not confront the internal ambiguity of a situation. This is what Malibu says. And she says the ambiguity of the situation is a contagion is something which you both sort of feel scared of. It arouses fear, but a contagion is, that's why you want to kind of run away from the contagion. You want to escape, you want to isolate, you want to segregate. But a contagion is also something which at the human level, in that sense, it's an anthropological thesis, is something which is a temptation. So she says, unlike thinkers like Georges Agamben and even Jean-Luc Nancy, such great thinkers who more or less see the entire question of contagion and the pandemic and so on and so forth. So between them, there was a debate going on, Agamben and Nancy. We don't have to go into that. But they are agreed on the point that eventually our terms of analysis today are biological life. Which is absolutely reduced to something essential and necessary, which is life itself, pure creaturely biological life. Malibu says even there is an excess. Even with people who are under threat, including the old people who are under threat from the virus, who could be ill on the threshold of death, or even the migrant population which is walking on the roads, which she mentions India after the brutal lockdown announcement. All of that, she says, is still, it carries what she calls very provocatively and very enigmatically, she calls an erotic excess. Here she is thinking of another great, early 20th century thinker of society and anthropology and civilization, Georges Bataille. And she takes from Bataille this point that all sacrificial actions of human beings have an excess. So it is true that the pandemic creates a sacrificial situation. So the corona warriors, even the police people who are under danger of getting infected because they have to deal with crowds, the medical people, of course, and everyone else, the migrant population, all of them are clearly sacrificial. They're kind of being sacrificed to the pandemic situation. But all sacrifice, through Bataille, Malibu says, already carries something which is an aura. In that sense, sacrifice has an excess. So the point is, it's a very difficult and yet a very clear point. It is this, that we don't measure a sacrifice by biological, in biological terms. We measure a sacrifice by something which is beyond sacrifice, or more than sacrifice, which is more than the economy of sacrifice. Because here, sacrifice is what? Sacrifices, by sacrificing, we will now invest the sacrifice in the solution to the problem of the situation. In old rituals, that used to be, for instance, the contagion of something impure in society. So Oedipus is to be sacrificed for Theban society to be purified. Similarly, in a sense, you could say that medical workers who go into a situation taking the risk of death are sacrificial to the eventual solution of the problem. But even with that, Malibu says there is an excess which itself cannot be measured in biological terms, which has to be measured in terms of what she calls desire, something which she calls erotic. It is a very bewildering idea, and yet it's a very compelling idea because it challenges the anthropology of sacrifice, or an anthropological reduction of human life to a sacrificial technology or a sacrificial thinking. This is something that Malibu does very early on in the pandemic analysis, and this is something which I myself think. I find it interesting for, though in a slightly different, through a different route, and that route is, in a less dramatic way, is this: that when we actually went into isolation, and we spoke of all those things that you spoke of in your introduction to the seminar, our mental health questions, our our alienation, our loneliness, dying alone in hospitals, and so on and so forth. Each of them either can be measured by the biological reality that, oh, this is what we have been reduced to. But that is not enough, because you see, death in itself is tautological. What is dead is dead. To measure a dying against death, one must already need some living measure. One cannot take the measure of death to measure death. This is the problem. So when you say that someone is lonely, then you're already using a living measure of desire. That desire not to be lonely. That Malibu is very right to call erotic. She is absolutely correct to call such a desire against which we measure everything that we measure. The loneliness of old people when they're dying in a hospital room. Why do we speak of loneliness there? Because we're already using the measure of desire. And that desire is human insofar as it is intersubjective. And the general name for this Malibu uses is erotic. In that sense, what she's doing, though apparently idiosyncratic, is actually extremely accurate and logical. That she is recognizing the fact that human subjectivity needs to be measured by something else than species, something other than species. It is social, intersubjective, and even can cross over to experiences and emotions and affects which can be taken from idioms and comparisons other than human. This is something which in anthropological terms, to me, becomes a very interesting and provocative idea, to think of something where the question of eros should be completely irrelevant and even, something very sort of indecent, as absolutely pertinent. Because eros, in this case, names the fundamental core of the desire that traverses human society, by which we measure everything that goes on, which is also suspension of that very eros in the pandemic. Just give me a sense of the time now. Give me a sense of the time.
It's 12, exactly 12.
It's exactly 12. So can I take 7 more minutes?
Yeah, sir, definitely you can take.
All right, 7 more minutes. All right. So in this context, I would like to take another example from a performance artist, a legendary performance artist, Latin American performance artist, Guillermo Gomez Pina, who, see, what happened was that in 2020 itself, in the US, someone called Richard Schechner, a well-known performance thinker, scholar, and theater director, he put out in his journal, which he has edited for many years, the Chilean Drama Review, TDR, a pro forma for several scholars related to performance and art and so on and so forth, asking a couple of questions. That what do you think will be the future of performance? What do you think will be the future of performance scholarship, performance teaching, and so on and so forth? Because again, his obvious, common sense sort of response was that, well, how can there be performance in such a situation? Because this situation is a situation of, the reduction of human lives to their biological bodies, which means you cannot in any way assemble in any other form than a biological form, which can only take place at the most in a medical context, in a hospital, so not in a theater, not in a in any other congregational form. So in response to these questions, we had several people from different parts of the world responding. Some of them were very voluble, a lot of things they said. And some were extremely, I mean, they responded, but they basically said that we have nothing to say at this point. When we have something to say, we'll get back to you. Right now, nothing to say. Guillermo Gomez Pena, he wrote, he didn't respond to these questions. His questions are probably extracted from a blog that he was writing. And he was writing relentlessly every day. But he wrote in a very different way. He wrote in a kind of poetic form, some poems, long poems. So I'm going to now read out. I mean, I can't read out. That's the trouble, because I can't read with my eyes. So I'll have to unwittingly perform the poem for you. A couple of lines, more than a couple, but I'd like to do that. These are lines that he wrote in July 2020. So the lines go something like this. Parts, I mean, these are parts, excerpts, again, excerpts, panorama, panoramic presentation. So the lines go something like this. Are artists, poets, musicians considered essential? If you are a performance artist, how do you embody your online? How do you cross digital borders with your wounded body? Will my art group survive the lockdown? Or will we have to declare bankruptcy like my family and my black and brown neighborhood? Are we slowly becoming the society of walking zombies? And then he writes, if you live by yourself, who do you cuddle with? With your dog or with a paranormal entity? Is sex work essential? Is love an essential reason for traveling and loitering? Can migrants and refugees who live in detention camps practice social distancing? Can prisoners, mostly Black and Latino in US prisons, practice social distancing? Is my isolation of privilege? And yours? So he asks questions like this in in a way that he writes, which is poetry. He writes them as blogs, day after day. And in each of these, blog, whatever he uploads, in each of them, there is this question of asking, can desire be thought of as essential? Is it possible? Or the moment we speak of essential or speak of necessary, as opposed to something which is on the side of freedom, we have already left the area or the possibility, the potential of something like desire, which includes love, but which can also include art, music, or any of that. Now, of course, it is true that during the first phase of the pandemic and later, art was used, but used in a very specific way. So you had music, online music programs, which were essentially understood as therapeutic. But what Pena is asking is something else. He's asking, what is the principle of art as a particular principle of potentiality, of human creativity, of virtuality? And can such a principle coexist with the principle that we mobilize so frantically, so obsessively during a pandemic and necessary, which is the principle of necessity? Is it possible to think of art and what is anthropologically essential together? What is anthropologically essential seems to be protection of human life. What is art seems to be something on the side of surplus, side of leisure, side of desire. Can one think of them together? So in a way, he's asking the same thing. Is it possible to think of art as something which is anthropologically connected to human creativity, and yet which is non-anthropocentric insofar as the principle is not human life or species. The principle is something else. To me, this is absolutely imperative to ask this question like this. So, for instance, in my own work, in my book, I asked whether it was possible to think of the migrant population walking on the roads, though of course involuntarily, their disobedience was involuntary, and at the same time, they, for instance, I mean, one read reports that when in Delhi government did it, or whoever did it in Delhi, there were camps set up, and these people they were given food. Some of them refused to eat because the taste was too monotonous. They asked for interesting food in a situation where they were not meant to ask. They're not supposed to ask for anything, which is basically food to reproduce your body. So in that sense, even under the severest conditions of physical threat and exigency, human beings, insofar as they are not simply anthropocentrically constituted, but are constituted beyond themselves, ask for something which apparently belongs to the principle of freedom, the freedom of desire, the freedom of taste, the freedom to find food interesting, even when it is a question of basically being able to eat or not. So this the government does not, no government understands, no governmental thinking understands, which is entirely centered on the principle of necessity, and what is essential and what is not essential, don't ask for it, don't even talk about it. It's a waste of time. The other obvious, and that is the last thing I'll say for the moment, the other obvious example or sight of this strange clash between principle of freedom and the principle of necessity, what is essential and what is not essential, is politics. So again and again we saw during this period that politics was seen as redundant or something which is self-indulgent or even antisocial, because politics comes from the freedom to make demands, the freedom to congregate, which seems to be not really anthropological but something else, whose principle seems to be something creative in the sense of creating new forms of human collectivity rather than the anthropological need to just be part of one collective, which is the apparently monotonous, uninteresting, unnecessary collective of being the spokesperson of species life. And yet, history happened, and history happens. So the obvious example of that in that period, 2020 and 2021, is the Black Lives Matter movement, which did not ever say, just like Shaheen Bagh did not ever say that, oh, we want to break the discipline or the requirements of the pandemic medical requirements of being careful, of wearing masks, of taking care not to infect others, and so on and so forth. They did not do that. But they did also say that there is another principle which is as much a principle of social collectivity, which is the principle of, in this case, in both cases, justice. In a way, it was not a transgression. It was a kind of indifference, and yet an indifference which was not callous. The people were wearing masks, but at the same time congregating. They took a distance from each other and yet walking together. So in that sense, it was not an anthropocentric anthropology that we were, witness to as a scenario. It was a scenario of, at the most, if it is thinkable at all, of a kind of anthropology built out of historicism. So of course, the most urgent and at the same time the most difficult task of this historical intelligence, the pandemic context, would be the task of thinking about our relationship to ecology, our relationship to nature, in the context of the emergency, that is the climate emergency, and think of that not in climatological terms, even natural terms, or even ecological terms, but to think of that in creative terms, in terms of a creation of a new collectivity, where the human being is already, in a sense, open to something which is other, which in that sense is not anthropological or anthropocentric. And yet it is not something which is entirely dissolved in the general web and ecstasy of nature. This to me seems to be the most urgent, and at the same time, a task which requires not just the pressure of urgency, but as much the freedom of leisure, or the freedom of a kind of free leisurely thinking, a free artistic thinking. In a way, whatever that's going to happen in this seminar, though unfortunately I will not be able to, really be to take advantage of this possibility of knowing more about the papers and hearing them. But still, I really would want to know, maybe from reading some of the abstracts again and hearing from you, whether this particular question of a non-anthropocentric and at the same time a historically intelligent human thinking can produce a certain kind of new and interesting space of discussion and conversation. I'm sure that I'll be able to, learn more from you at some point about what happened with regard to this possibility. So thank you for your attention. And if there is time, I would really like to hear what you have to say about all of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a really intellectually stimulating session. Not only it would be unfair to call it just stimulating, but in a way you sterilize the kind of policy, what the haphazards the policy makers have caused through their policy, and rethinking and actually rethinking about the anthropomorphic idea itself of how human centricism was not actually the centric idea of this entire discourse of the pandemic itself, was an extremely intellectual discourse to think through. And now we have some time for questions and answers. So I would like my colleague Aditi to take up a few questions from the chat box.
You'll have to
Right.
read them out to me.
Yes.
Yeah. So to begin with, I'm sure more people are still processing that very thought-provoking session. But I have a question here from Ruchi, which I will read out. The pandemic met with an absolutely overwhelming response from the literary world. The way people talked about it, wrote about it, etc. Even children's literature during this phase centered around pandemic. Why this outburst? As this is one thing that historically distinguishes this pandemic from all other in the history of human civilization. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Absolutely, you're right. That there was a kind of overwhelming response, and there was a kind of there was a kind of an isolated energy, that a strange mixture of isolation and energy. Well, I think part of it was, and of course, you're right. There was also a great flourishing on and a great proliferation of genres that responded to the pandemic. One of the reasons for this happening probably would also be, with the globalized world, more energetic and complicated channels of global communication. So in that sense, what I observed over those many years, and even now, is that not all of this literature was being produced by necessarily recognized and identified literary authors or literary, personalities, personae. Much of this was also being done at the level of something more spontaneous and more situated, because in the world of social media, in the world of this sort of endless communication, though of course it creates a terrible corrosion and several other things that we can talk about, it also does make it possible for people to create idioms and discourses which do not necessarily conform only to both the identities of professional authorship and literary occupation of the writer, nor does it have to entirely be in the well-known genres and classes of literary production, the novel and the autobiography and the poem and so on. There's far greater improvisation that is possible. And that possibly is one reason why it has happened on a global scale, because those possibilities were provided. But at the same time, the real question is, what are the main preoccupations of this, or what is the main concern? What are the what is the thinking that is stimulated by this literary output, this literary proliferation? You will find that there is already in the history of the plague, during several plagues that took place over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, literature has always been produced. And often literature has been produced which does not really purport to be therapeutic or be already something which takes the entire the entire human collectivity, or literally the empirical collection of human beings as one single unit, to be then through a cultural and through literary instruments be given succor or given support, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it is not necessarily therapeutic. On the contrary, a lot of literature in medieval literature around the plague was a literature of a certain kind of mockery, a kind of auto-mockery of human behavior, how human beings during the plague also behave in the most ridiculous ways. And that's the comic literature, a literature which sometimes was provocative and even insulting towards people or part of society which became extremely obsessed with their physical security. So, for instance, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a short story where he depicted a certain, a garrison or some sort of a military fortification, which for several months completely sealed itself against anyone coming from outside, and in that sense seemed to have protected itself totally from the virus, from the virus which brought the plague in. And then after a long time, maybe 6, 7, 8 months, it hosted a party in celebration of the fact that it survived. In that sense, made this very decadent kind of thing about enjoying yourself now that you're living while the rest of the world is dying. That you turned out to be more disciplined, more clever. So now let's let ourselves go. And then once the party is happening, people are dancing, there is a particular person, or not a figure, a persona, who is dancing, and it's a kind of strange kind of a moment. That persona or that personality is in a kind of a red apparel, a red costume, and is now circulating literally among the people on the dance floor. And that persona it's the Red Death. It is the virus. It's an anthropomorphic depiction of how the virus has entered that very space of decadent celebration, against the victory, or is a celebration of the victory against the virus. The virus has entered that space of decadent human space. So it is a literature which makes humanity not look so good. In contrast to that, I would think much of the literature that has come out, though I can't be sure about this because I haven't read a lot of all of this, but my guess is that a lot of this literature is very different. I'm not saying better or worse, or more interesting or less, but very different, where The literature is something which takes human society as already constituted as something more as a unit, as a unity. And that is inevitable in a globalized world, which was not the case with either 18th century literature or 19th century or even the earlier medieval literature. So anyway, these are points that we could discuss.
Right. Thank you for your response, sir. We have a lot of questions and comments coming in. So what I'll do is that I'll sort of merge a very common point that is being made with the lecture, is that this need for protest, this need for art, this need to choose. We understand it as the important, the essential excess that human life must be about. But at the same time, is this really going beyond the anthropocentric? I mean, we understand that we are constrained. We must address our essential excess, but then how do we go beyond this? How do we go to the non-anthropocentric, or escape our limited beings and think about a more panoramic world? And I'm thinking this also in the context of the error that you were talking about in the beginning, how you said that every time you typed anthropocentric, it would turn into anthropomorphic. Then is there a particular threat that we feel while we try to think in a zoomorphic manner? I mean, we don't really talk about the word zoomorphic as much as we talk about the word anthropomorphic. What is the threat that we feel when we zoomorphize ourselves, that we would be terribly reduced to something, the very basics, very medicalized, very biological existence? I mean, shouldn't we have questions like, do animals daydream? I mean, what is that is so threatening that we can't even think that, oh, maybe there is something creative in zoomorphic existence as well?
No, absolutely. So this is a fantastic question. It will take some time, so we won't have that sort of that. Let me just answer you, on that point, last point. Do animals daydream? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. That's not the point. I mean, that is the point, but the one way of responding to that point is that who can ask this question? See, you might be right, and this is an absolutely worthwhile possibility to explore, that whether animals dream, daydream, or what is a dream in the context of the animal. But that something more preliminary is at stake. That who asks the question of the daydream? Because when we speak of daydream, we are already speaking of a signification. So one of the points that I was not able to make, and your question gives me a chance to make that point, is that, and this is a psychoanalytic point, I suppose, what interposes between the human and the non-anthropocentric is language. So daydream is already a concept, is already a signifier. It has a range of possible significations. So we think of biological life as if it has no signification. It is what it is, but it is not. Biological life is also signification. Already there is a distance, and there is a surplus, and there is a lack in what we think is absolutely what it is, biological life, species life. Marx understood this better than anyone else, that when human beings speak of species life, they're the only ones who think of what, it's not a question of whether they do or others don't. Point is that the question of species life is arising from that very anthropological threshold. So there is something which we cannot avoid, and yet we cannot take as in a kind of, in the way that, say, great 18th century European philosophy did, took it simply as a sign of what Kant calls human, or in that sense, anthropological maturity. The anthropology meets history finally, according to Kant. There was always anthropology. Human beings were already sort of anthropologically grounded, constituted. But finally, now we have a historical consciousness of our anthropological sort of constitution. So Kant said we have now finally sort of reached a stage of maturity. That is also what we call enlightenment. In a way, the pandemic is the end of the enlightenment. Absolutely, or at least a great blow. I said this. Europe, which is created through the enlightenment idea, felt the greatest shock. South Asia has not responded in the same way that, global South hasn't responded in the same way that Europe did. Why? One of the reasons is that the so-called Enlightenment shock, or the shock to that Enlightenment coherence, did not take place here because the other shocks that took place or have been taking place. So in that sense, the question is important. Who asks this question? So if the question is put from a so-called human position, then already we are seeing an entanglement. The question is right. Derrida was the great thinker for these things, that you can not even say animal without already making it something anthropomorphic. Even we use terms in psychoanalysis, for instance, instinct, instinctual life. But even instinct is a signification. Instinct is not something absolutely primitive. So what interposes between us and the other is language. So maybe that could be the site where we can conduct these explorations. And like I said, in the pandemic, from the very beginning, particularly in the globalized world, in a capitalist rationality, within a capitalist rationality, it was very important that the linguistic technology of performative utterance be deployed and unleashed by the World Health Organization, which, remember, was not a simple affair. At that very linguistic moment of saying this was a pandemic, immediately questions were raised. Did you say it too soon? Did you say it too late? What was your attitude, or what was your your position with regard to its physical localized origin in China? Was the WHO too soft towards China, or was it doing something which was on a ground of pure, legitimate, neutral, fair assessment of the situation? All of these political institutional questions were raised. Why? Because of the linguistic deployment. So already language interposes between the human subject and the world.
Thank you so much for your response, sir. We are running short of time, and you have filled our time, and I'm sure very fulfillingly, and we shall be carrying these thoughts for a very long time. I would invite Simi ma'am for some closing comments, maybe.
Not really, Aditi, but I think Professor Babu Thalia from JNU is here, and I think he's raised his hand. So maybe, Stephen, if you could just unmute him, I think he wants to ask a question.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. So sorry for being a latecomer, and because I was struggling to frame a question, in fact. Thanks, Shoma, for this wonderful speech. I'm just thinking of, I mean, not in very specific terms, but in a broader terms, like the genesis of the transcendentalism in the modern philosophy, and culminating in Kant, and then going further. And in tune with what you have said about the anthropocentric or anthropomorphic, I think of Nietzsche in terms like anthropomorphic, that. So my question is, aren't we still entangled in a kind of epistemological directionality with the transcendentalism, that from subject to the object, that always, and there are historical cases even before pandemic where this was shattered, and still we never learned, like the earthquake in Lisbon, for example, about which Voltaire wrote a poem, and so I think it's the givenness of the world, and as you in your last answer rightly point out, everything is anthropomorphic, maybe this givenness is so sidelined, and there are a lot of leftover in philosophy, starting from Descartes' res extensa to Kant's thing in itself. Lots of things are left over, and we don't really care about that. And this givenness, where we have a setback, and after this, like the earthquake in Lisbon, now the pandemic, and the world points to that givenness, as against this transcendental predominance of humanity. So I just thought of these things. Maybe.
Yeah, thank you, Babu. No, absolutely, very pertinent, very profound comments. So yes, I mean, you're right. This is something which I too, had in the back of my mind. In the very time of the so-called Enlightenment, there were deep doubts about such an enlightenment. So between Voltaire and Alexander Pope and all of them at that time, the Lisbon earthquake raised some fundamental questions about the so-called anthropological optimism, of an age of enlightenment, when nature can come in with such devastating, brute, very indifferent shattering of that sort of optimism. And how can you sustain a consistent optimism, an anthropological optimism? And that question, in a sense, becomes even more poignant, even more sort of insistent in a globalized world where, or in capitalist globalization, not just globalized world, but in capitalist globalization, because here we really cannot even think of a direct access, something even like an earthquake. So even an earthquake today would already be speaking through some sort of system of exchange. At least at that time, because of the early sort of order of capitalist society in Europe, there was still some sense of nature as something, like you're saying, a kind of givenness, with a kind of facticity, but with the capitalist globalized situation, it seems to me that word situation becomes even more rigorous and even more oppressive. That nothing is really given to us as pure givenness, and at the same time there cannot be no givenness either. So there is a kind of impasse, there is a kind of inconsistency on the threshold, which really bothers us, which really troubles us. And that's why we have responses which either try to dissolve this trouble in a kind of naturalistic nobility. Bruno Latour, the great philosopher who died recently, spoke of in very beautiful and yet unreal terms that now we should not go back to the same world once we have gone through the pandemic. But it's not a question of a choice of going back or not going back, because the pandemic, like I said, speaks through that market society. As much as the market society is also, in a sense, interrupted by the pandemic. You can't really disentangle them cleanly, distinctly. So it's not a question of going back or not going back. So that Latour prescription was noble and beautiful, but ecologically, while it meant something, historically it seemed to me, well, not really something which we can do anything about, or we can really respond to it at that level. So this kind of prescription. So yes, so that seems to me to be the real dilemma. So in that sense, to raise this question at the impasse itself, the impasse of history, which is as much an impasse of nature, to raise the question is something which is far more important than something that has been going on since the beginning of the pandemic, which is prescription, which is prescription after prescription. Everyone has become a policymaker, not just a policymaker, or thinking from within the heads of policymakers. That seems to me to be something which might be a bit of a loss to the other principle that I talked about, which is the principle of art. So this seminar is a chance for principle of art to return. Yeah. Policy making.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for this extremely stimulating session. You have spoken like a giant intellectual tree, out of which so many of our sessions are branching out on performance, art, ethnography, and so much more. And I think this is definitely a lecture and Q&A that we should send to all policymakers across the world, because this is exactly what they need to listen to. And now we are officially closing this session, and I give it over to Sananda to do the official vote of thanks. And thank you, sir, once again for this.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Firstly, Professor Choudhury, it was a singular honor to be able to host you today, and you have very graciously and kindly accepted our invitation. There are so many young students and scholars present today, and your talk was extremely lucid, and I think everybody benefited immensely from your erudition, and it was deliciously ironic. it had what philosophy calls aporia. I mean, to navigate that inherent disjunction of human superiority yet vulnerability was absolutely thrilling. It is something that we will always remember and cherish. Thank you so very much. I will actually also take this opportunity to thank Jamia administration for having very promptly agreed and facilitated in making this conference possible for us. The department for always fostering and nurturing academic spirit and really providing scholars with the opportunity for growth. Simi ma'am, who's our head, for being the absolute undying support and encouragement behind this, and being with us every step of the way. Thank you, ma'am. For the presenters, without whom I don't think this would have been possible. We thank you all for contributing your ideas and making this a very enriching experience. And today and tomorrow, this is the weekend. So rapporteurs, moderators, chairs, thank you all for shouldering the responsibility and being with us. Thank you so much. And last, but of course not the least, my co-team members, the organizers. I mean, we have weathered many storms together and sailed through rough seas, and you two have made it possible. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ruchi. And we had a tremendous response to this conference. So the audience in general for expressing interest and being with us today. Thank you all. So the originally schedule had a tea break. We would have gone for tea, but right now there isn't much time. So we will continue with our session, which is punctuating the pandemic, literature and confinement. And I will hand it over to the rapporteur for the session, Arisha. Please take it forward, and thank you all once again.
Can I just interrupt, Shobhada? I don't know if you're staying or if you're leaving, but thank you so much, Shobhada. Really, really grateful to you. Really, I mean, this was
No, thank you. As long as it made some sense.
Absolutely, it was the best keynote really with which this conference could have opened.
Thank you, Simi. Thank you again.
Shobhada, we'll meet again. I mean,
absolutely, it's fantastic to be part of this, and yes, I mean, eventually in person.
Yes. I'll plan something. Thanks, Shobhada. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simi. See you soon.
Yeah, see you.
Yeah, and bye, Babu. Thanks. If you're there. Yeah.
Right.
Bye, Shoma. Bye, Shoma. We should meet on this course, yeah. Post-pandemic.
Right. Sorry, Adisha. Sorry.
Yeah, yes. And thank you to Aditi as well for moderating the previous session. And now we hand it over to Arisha for the next session.
Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to the second session of the day titled Punctuating the Pandemic, Literature and Confinement. This session will be chaired by Grace Mariam Raju, who is a PhD scholar in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Over to you, Grace.
I think the Grace needs to be made a co-host. She's not the co-host. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I think directly we should move to the first session for this conference, which is Punctuating the Pandemic. The first speaker is Vikram K. Pancham. I hope all the speakers are here, and yes, they have all switched on their cameras. So as we all know, we have 20 plus 5 minutes of time. So I'll give you the first warning at the end of 15 minutes, followed by a ring at, before, like say 2 minutes before the time, and then followed by 5 minutes of Q&A, which Arisha will take all the questions and take you through the questions. The first speaker is Vikram K. Pancham, he's a PhD scholar at African Studies Center, University of Leiden, and Center for African Studies at University of Edinburgh. His paper is titled Panoramas of Memory, like screams that died in their throat, floating up to an unmade world, an epistemology of the pandemic closet prison from South African shimmerings on the water. Over to you, Vikram.
Good day, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. So good day, everyone. Molweni. Molweni is how we also greet in isiXhosa to a group of people. Molo is how you greet to one person. So yeah, greetings are important and languages are important about where are you local to. And across the course of my research, I've been invited to be local to many places, not invited necessarily from an outside question, but I would say invited from an inside question. For me, the work of Archie Mafeje, an African studies scholar, about endogenous knowledge, knowledge that comes from within, is important to me. It also connects with Spivak's work on critical intimacy, to be deeply intimate with the materials that you're working with, and also the context and the peoples that you're working with. And so it is only from an intimacy that you can have certain kinds of compassion and creativity. I'm going to try and do as much as I can in the 20 minutes or the 19 minutes so far. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to connect with you, esteemed colleagues and peers and professors, some of whose work I've seen and used, and some of whose work might appear if I can get to it in this paper. So I have combined my writings and my artwork that I'm presenting. And so let's go on a little bit of a journey and we see where it takes us. Okay, at a certain point, I might share a presentation and come back to the video and then come back to my face. So let's go ahead and see what we can do. Yeah. Okay. Right. So I've entitled the paper Panoramas of Memory, trying to take snapshots of a multi-wide shot view through several glances. And in this paper, I'm playing with the glance or the nazar or the nigar, the look to gaze upon, to see what it might yield. The destination of the paper I'm trying to make for and trying to make place for is, I might say, simple. It's that a truth is always in plain sight, simple and unhidden. It is a question then of developing the right way of seeing, of casting off imbecility, of casting the right gaze, a nigahe karam, something of a merciful glance to see where it might take us. So I glanced at 4 pieces of artwork I made during the pandemic, and the glance that I'm able to make with you to still try and cultivate or receive a merciful glance back from this work. I'm connecting this with Lacan's reading of Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter, which I'm going to quote briefly from at the start. Perhaps it is the very simplicity of the thing which puts you at fault. Perhaps the mystery is a little too plain, a little too self-evident. So the 4 pieces, I'm going to disable that. Right. So the 4 pieces that I work with are a poem, a short story, a digital live art performance, and a set of flashcards. And I ask you to wonder about the contents of them, if the contents of them are important, or actually if the contents is empty, and it is more the circulation of these art pieces or letters, perhaps. Like in Edgar Allan Poe's Purloined Letter, the letter's contents is not exactly known or read out, but it is known in a way that the letter will incriminate the queen, in some kind of way. And Lacan's reading is more about the circulation of the letter, the movement of the letter between different hands through different glances. To start off again, the lines of Faiz Ahmed Faiz's Hum Dekhenge kind of circulate around how I think about witness and how we will witness things that that attempt to outlive us, but that we will inevitably outlive. So at first glance, I'm sharing, and this is in the genre of a bit of a diary testimonial, to give a circling in on the topic. So the topics that I will deal with and some of the art pieces have very sensitive content. And so I also find it may be useful for us to try and approach it in a way that's less jarring and less dumping, that we shouldn't be dumped into narratives non-consensually, dumped outside of them. So in writing the paper is hard. It seems a matter too of a block, of a burnout, of pain, but I'm trying. I have a right to speak, and I have to write this paper to speak. So speaking is a way that unlocks exhaustion and sadness, and also great liberties for the person I created. I guess the one letter replaces the other. There is so much, but not much anymore. How many oral histories do you have? None. Therefore, I'm creating something new, but not any. A rest. So for any of our listeners and colleagues who are here, if you would, of course, like to choose as you will, please, I welcome this. Rest and silence, dipping in and out of this paper as you choose. What do I say that's been said that hasn't been said before to a pandemical audience? I'll concentrate more on prison. Closets like this, like being imprisoned and coming out of the closet or even coming into a society. What is your data? A famous question asked. And how does it capture some elements of the South African experience, the African, the native, and so forth? But endogenous? Well, I might say people here don't come out much. They kind of just operate within, coming out of the closet. Well, I'm not talking about white sexualities and rampant sexualism or hypersexualizations. Well, also to say in Southern Africa, people were imprisoned. Let us echo from there, like from my Angela of Bengal, who was brought to the Cape by the Dutch in either 1655 or 1657 as an enslaved woman from Bengal. On having a slave who produced children, this means a sex slave, imported and manumitted later. But the role of it was a sex worker, unpaid, to put out. Was childbirth inevitable? Was it not? Why were European women not brought as sex slaves for the Dutch? Why the Indian Ocean slaves from Bengal, Malabar? That's almost 400 years ago. And sex was always what humans did, even before then. Mating for pleasure, for maintenance, to evade loneliness. My hand is sore from writing. It's sore because the swimming instructor, the lifeguard at the pool, bent it while he was raping me. He held it behind my back and said, "If you scream, I will kill you, like dead fish." So did you know who did it to me, Mum, Dad? He knew it was Dad's friend, and Dad knew, and she knew something. But she was gone, staring out at another world, outside the bedroom door where she tried to hang herself and die. These are the stories I carry inside me. That is why my hand hurts. And there's a stupid, silly paper to write. What if life is like, what is life like if your rape status is 0? What is life like for people who have not been raped? Domestic violence cases went up, public rapes went down in the pandemic. Boys were Molested again? The lifeguard in his red Speedos put it there in me once. It was paining. He was fat and ugly, no coverings of his body. That is how they used me. So my screams. Why do you wish to tell this story? In a museum, in a set of flashcards? Why am I tired? Can't I sleep too? A little boy needs to sleep. Therefore, I was not raped. Therefore, nothing happened to me when I was small. Therefore, I have no knowledge of the final act. You can tell me what you did to the boy's body in the morning, but don't. Don't tell me what you did. I'll never say. There was no baby born because boys can't be pregnant. I guess that's how it's always been. Men and women don't care. They've killed children before, but how often do children kill them? Yes, writing is filthy, an act of recording hell. It shouldn't be done. Start. At this point, I'll play the first set of art. This is the first art piece. It's a set of flashcards that were produced. So all the art pieces that I talk about and hopefully can get through are produced during the pandemical period. And they have a bit of a sequence to them. Okay. Can you see me on this one? Yeah, can you see the, great.
Pancho, it's a white screen.
It's a white screen now.
Oh, then I'll try and play it in another way. Sorry about that. Stop that share. Paid for now. So can you see a video now? Yes, okay, great. I'll just move through them. Okay. Okay. And I stop the share there. Okay. Okay, in that set of flashcards, I moved through a series of questions, but in a way, it's only one question, and the answer may already be known. So the point of the flashcards might not be to ask the question. For this, we go to Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter and Lacan's reading of this. I'll give a brief synopsis to guide us through. So Lacan gives a psychoanalytical reading of Poe's The Purloined Letter, which was published in 1844, about 40 years after the 1804 moment of the Haitian Revolution, about 13 years before the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and 1 year after the British annexed the region of Natalia in southern Africa from the Dutch Boers, who occupied it for 5 years. After the Boers had waged war among and on the Amazulus in the Battle of Blood River, whose anniversary was actually yesterday, the 16th of December in 1838. So they left 3,000 dead in the river. The river was so red, hence the Battle of Blood River. The British then seized Natalia and made the British colony, the British Natal colony, from 1843. 11 years after the first shipment of Indians was made outside of India to Mauritius, under the newly formed system of labor called indentured labor, or girmit, as the system of bonded labor was transitioning from enslavement to indenture. So on the 16th of November then, 1860, 16 years after the purloined letter was published, the first shipments of girmitias, Indian indentured laborers, were brought to Natal, the region from which I grew up. And the 16th of December, yesterday, is currently held as a public holiday, the Day of Reconciliation, to symbolically reconcile between the onslaught of the indigenous peoples and the breakaway Europeans in the Battle of Blood River. So in his seminar, Lacan offers us many ways to think with, from which I'm selecting a few. And because of time, I'm going to try and move through it quite quickly because I think I might have less than 10 minutes left.
You just have 5 minutes, yeah.
Thank you. So in the synopsis of the letter, a queen receives a letter in her royal parlor, the contents of which would incriminate her, the reader is told. And so in embarrassment, she tries to hide it from her king when he comes into the room. But the minister is there doing some work, and he notices her agitation and notices the letter. Through glances, they exchange this information. And so he tactfully and duplicitously exchanges this letter in plain sight of her, because she is powerless to intervene, else it would out her. So he replaces it with some kind of other letter and takes her original letter and keeps it for a period of time. She employs the service of the police and the prefect to try and retrieve this letter, but they can't find it in searching his hotel room and his apartment. So she employs the detective. The detective, upon searching the apartment, finds the letter in plain sight, because his logic and strategy says that it wouldn't be hidden somewhere people would be looking for. It's actually quite simple and obvious. So on another day when he's visiting when the detective is visiting the minister, he exchanges the letter with a fake that he's made when the minister is actually not glancing at him. And so the original letter finds its way back to the queen. So what's important here is a few glances. Lacan points us to about 3 glances. One is a kind of absent glance between the king and the police that don't notice what is going on. The second type of glance are those between the queen and the minister exchanging knowing glances and working in a kind of concealment and revealment. And the third glance is the detectives, which is much more about looking for things in plain sight or with the right sight, not necessarily plain sight. So upon looking at the flashcards, because of time again, I'll move very quickly to the next piece, which is the poem. To look at these art pieces and ask what is the question in them? Are these flashcards really for a certain audience? Or in Lacan's reading, that a letter always arrives at its destination, and with Zizek's reading of that, suggesting that the sending of the letter itself is the arrival, that it comes out, and that the letter always arriving at its destination is inevitably that you cannot escape your fate, in that we will die. And that is perhaps a surety. So the next art piece, which I thought was important to share, is a poem called Gay Lives Are Short, or Love in the Time of Corona. Gay lives are short. Risk. You already lose 20 or so in the upbringing, almost de facto, 20 years. So you come at life, already trying to play catch up, to regain, recover, and make up for lost time. Making up for lost time, lost place, lost bodies. Gay life is short. We already lose so much. I'm thinking of risking it in the time of Corona. I can't spend 2 more years losing What do they understand of high-risk sexual behavior? Of our very sexuality is made by them risky, high risk, closeted, and a lot. It's not about AIDS. It's not about STDs. It is about risk to our survival against their brutal daily bread, dealt out before pandemical minds started to think. Our very hearts are made to be the disease carriers, vulnerable to infection, terminal, fatal, a plague again to their worldview. They made us risky. We are only at risk of being recipients of their violence. How long can I wait? I decided I will never live again under a straight person's house, under a straight person's roof. I will not, never again. This, after a cute encounter with a cute man, gorgeous, asking me to buy him a drink twice. Damn, he's so cute. A security man at a building. How the tables have turned and security guards are my flatterers. And seeing life going, people living. I can't live here anymore at 6 Mountbatten Drive because I am gay and they are not.
Can you please wind up in a minute?
Thanks. So I'll wind up, I'll say a little bit and then share an image from the last art piece.
Yeah.
So this poem, I think, speaks to some things from Arundhati Roy's questions in her Pandemic is a Portal. And her questions of risk. Who couldn't think of risk? Who couldn't think of an ordinary exchange, an ordinary kiss without risk now? So in the midst of terrible despair, the pandemical mind ruptured between normality and an unmade world, beckoning to us, perhaps as an imperative, with cognitive dissonance, with an insightful rupture, glaring back at us, glancing, what will you do? How will you go about it? Will you attend to the flashcards or will you attend to the poem and the one letter that each carries in them? Dignity, food, shelter, and some familiarity, and possibly love. From its gaze, the rupture to ours, it asked us for a chance to rethink the doomsday machine. So I'll share the picture and then end with this few lines.
Yeah.
You can see the PowerPoint, yes? Yeah. So here's a picture of 4 moments in time. At the top is the name change of a building of Sarah Bartman Hall, who was an enslaved woman, taken and exhibited around Europe. And unfortunately, even further, when she died, her body was cut up and displayed in jars in the French museums. And her human remains were only repatriated in 2002. So for about 200 years, she was on display in the exhibit. And in the top right, you'll see, or the other side, you'll see the sky, which her bones must have seen when she was being repatriated. In the bottom, you see a patch of grass and an ant. And the black screen is actually the reading of a story called Two Boy Ogres and an Old River Bird, which I'll read a few lines from now. So our ogre, the keeper of the stream, dancer of rivers and friend of tortoises, chatted to the old bird. And she asked him, who will you forgive? Who will you forgive in this nature? Forgiveness, he asked. Permission, grace, blessing, release, she said. Who will you take off the rock, the boulder from? He thought. He began learning. 1,000 rivers and old birds of learning. He heard her. Whoever needs forgiveness, he offered. Whomever's forgiveness he had the means to alleviate, she heard. Forgiveness of who he's meant to forgive, for whom it is correct to forgive, for him to do, perhaps with a merciful glance. Forgiveness of matter is not a matter of his origination, the real matter that needs forgiving away. Rather, it is a gift, like the moving of rocks in the stream to make way for the river to flow, an understanding, a labor from one to another. Anyone can forgive anyone else, it seems, to release the burdens that have come up in an undue way. The end. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Vikram. And it's very interesting that how you connected the slave history, the idea of bondage with the queer community during the lockdown, especially traversing through the closeted space. We have roughly around 4 minutes of Q&A. So I just want to open the floor by by sort of engaging with you this idea of violence that you demonstrated through your flashcards. I mean, that brought back a lot of memories. And this was very rampant. I mean, there were different forms of violence that were being reported onto people who were sort of staying at home, and therefore this idea of stay at home during the pandemic was very, very violent for many people. And also at the same time, it was a matter of luxury for another section of people. So how do you think that, looking back at the history that you've presented and looking at the queer community, how do you think that if we are to interpret this new age bondage that was sort of created even for a short period of time during the pandemic, how do you think they created the everydayness of a closeted prison-like home for the queer community? I think there's one question in the chat box as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Grace, Raju, for your question. I'll try and speak first about the New Age bondage. And I like this idea of the idea of glancing and re-glancing at the closet through the, not so much the lens, but to maybe even do away with, because I'm not really a user of the closet or the conceptual and the ideological and the ontological. I maintain that the closet is something that, we don't go into and come out of or need to come out of, but it is built around us brick by brick. And we know that it's pervasive. It's everywhere, it's anytime, and it's instantiated. But I find the prison more useful, and going back to legal histories and so forth, like dredging up the old bonded histories of enslaved people to indentured people, and then to anti-colonial activists like Amit Kathrada or so forth. The prison and the building through codified laws, and then through verbal discourse of don't do this, don't say this, don't come out, you are now, this is blamed on religion, or it's a Muslim thing, no, the conservatives are going to have an issue here, and so forth. It's firmly a building brick by brick, including how the pandemic is built PCR test by PCR test, data by data. Because without the data, there's no pandemic, there's no virus, you're not infected. If you don't have this data, there is nothing to institutionalize there. I think what my paper is trying to look at is the cognitive work and almost the imperative, the survivalist imperative to deal with risk and apprehend, and where the screams can die and float up, but they're floating up to an unmade world. It's, for us, a generation which is this first generation of this pandemical world, in a way. We can call it opportunity, but the imperative to breathe, to kiss, is calling and beckoning. And so while the domestic violences that people were concentrated in the lockdown, which is a prison concept, the prison is in lockdown. And so society is always a pervasive prison, which is just instantiated. So the prison, the society, the closet, the pandemic, moving between them as institutions, I'm finding it more useful for us to think about the prison, how it's built, but then what kind of work we need to do vis-a-vis or against the prison. Is it the prison break, or breaking out, or saying to heteros, look, it's your closet, you deal with it, you break it, you destroy the prison, or so forth. It's very idealistic, but it doesn't change the realistic question of returning the letter to the original keeper and maybe asking the question. And so on the two sides, it's this concentration of violence and bondage where the bricks are being built again. But in the fixity of it, it's a different kind of prison, because these jailers are also doing different things. And so the urge to perhaps forgive or cast a merciful glance might be something of the invitation. And I'm not prescribing this for others. or saying that this is what should be done, what is easily done, that I have done it. But these are just glances, you know, it's one look. If you look correctly, maybe with the right nazar, you can have an intellectual, a cognitive move, this portal, slowly doing something. And in that way, you choose what to attend to. The flashcards and looking for, I don't need the answer to that question. It's already known. But the quest of how do you deal with the short life, the risk. And so the story that I wrote is one of a soothing story to hold a very bonded, abused history, a queer story to hold between queer feminist solidarity. And I think for me, it's something about that moves beyond, maybe sublimates or transforms beyond treating and dealing with the modern ways in which, I'll wrap it up here, the modern ways in which you look for justice, especially for people who've been abused in certain ways. Because, you know, what is that going to do? Dealing with the closet and those court cases about rape or so forth, the person has really to create a new space in them. And forgiveness has been, you know, an interesting concept that I never had much use for before, but it's not so much a modern concept of forgiveness. It's about nigah-e-karam, a kind of merciful glance and dealing with this, a kind of aesthetic and inner endogenous work for perhaps perpetrators and dealers with the closet. Because what is the justice? Is it that I get you to admit you've answered these questions, or that we are actually in love with each other and that we have built our intimacies with each other and that they don't continue to be ruptured and violated by the instantiation of the closets? Is that, can we actually be in relationships of love and beauty with each other? Whether you are public about it or not, whether you are discreet about it or not, it's not the question. Can you actually be in love continuously and die like anybody else?
Okay, so I think Arisha will take you through the chat box. There are 2 questions, so maybe you can quickly respond to.
Right, yes. So, Vikram, that was a really thought-provoking presentation, and we are getting a lot of questions here. So I'll just say the 2 more important ones here. So Stephen has asked, there's a perplexing idea of lockdown and restriction in your presentation in relation to queer bodies. So how do you think a queer ontology is different, and how does the effect heighten in discourse of the pandemic? And Soumya has asked a question. She says that, as I understand, a veil of silence surrounds the perpetrator while the survivor speaks out. How does the silence strengthen or weaken complicity on the part of the perpetrator? So, Vikram, if you could please comment on these.
Yes, thank you so much, Arisha, and for your questions, Stephen and from Soumya. Yeah, Stephen, queer ontology is interesting to me. It reminds me of some of our chats about how I've even said, you know, and how I would describe for us here, or anyway, it's not about sexual orientations. It is about a worldview, a world orientation, and not even the worldview, which is the ocular, but it is a sense of which you're oriented in the world. So queer ontology, and I also don't use queer so much necessarily, especially if it's for those who gaze from outside a queer intimacy, because it still has the valence of what others proclaimed it to be. Queer, for a useful term in queer communities, I think is quite fine, but not letting them use concepts that continue to exhibit us in a Sarki Bartman freak show is some things that I guard against. So these notions of publicity and privacy are important. And I think they relate to the second question about silence as well. How is it different? How does it maybe heighten in the pandemical enclosures as well? It's different because of I would say the total nature, because it's an ontological orientation. It informs our epistemologies, how we see, and the queer space of thinking still seems to be heavily dealing with reconciling its ways of thinking with other dominant systems of thinking, which it didn't set the terms of, but they have a brute force, they have a marauding force, a beat you up force, a hold your hand and twist your hand behind your back while certain acts are being performed, So the strength of your intellectual argument means nothing. You're just being beaten into actually acquiescing to a certain thing. So for me and queer politics, I'm much more concerned about us writing the ontological, the orientation into what does it have to do with the sexual orientation? What does it have to do with sex? What does queer have to do with sex or bodies? It's about how your worldview and or a self, if you have that, is oriented, and who really kills you and on what terms, to make the treaties with death. Are you still being killed by others, or can you die as your own person? Death is too inclusive in this ontological question and how we come to terms with our own death. So I think it requires, I won't say it requires more of us, that there's some kind of exceptionalism, we are better or thinking, but it does require cognition that you can't necessarily find that's just there. You have to make it. And you have to, that's why it's an unmade world. So the screams that die and float up the throat like dead fish, which is from Arundhati's God of Small Things, they're not exactly the same for us. They might be, the floating up might be an opportunity through which we live. This is not to romanticize the death drive as well, but it is to make our peace and our treat with death, that it's my death, that whether I die or whether a person takes their own life, or whether the community has beat them up and killed them, which happens, can you still die as your person? So it reminds me of Thich Huan Duc, the Buddhist monk who immolated himself at the time of the Vietnam War. And
if you could just quickly wrap up.
Yeah, sure. It's about speaking and silence, that, as I understand, yes, it's the perpetrator enjoys a veil of silence, but they also enjoy the kind of vacuity of memory. They often don't have memory of what has been committed, because that's been the transference of the record and the archive and the burden for us to sink dying in these waters with the memory of things. And so on the one hand, to jettison the memory and say, it never happened to me as a child, as a boy, therefore I can actually go to sleep now. That for me, those are interesting. So I'm interested in also looking at indigenous ways of dealing with things like sexualized abuse, domestic violence, rape. And it's in the R word. I hardly use the R word. And, are we going to look at other words like forced upon? If it's balatkar, it's like, it's the force of it and it violated and so forth. But the way the R word is just doled out non-consensually, the right to privacy and respect is taken away once again. The silence of the perpetrator, this privilege and the right to privacy of them, there is a right to privacy for the so-called victim, but I'd say the target of the violence. To, it's romantic to resist, but we also, the last thing, thanks, I'm so sorry, Grace.
No, you can carry on to write your thoughts in the chat box, and maybe we can move on to the second speaker.
So it's about the right to privacy that people also need. And you can go and look for earlier concepts than even decolonization and older words rather than queer and so forth. But the right to privacy and peace. Yeah. So thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thank you, Vikram. That was a very interesting presentation. And with that, we move to our next speaker, Indrani Das Gupta. Indrani is a PhD scholar at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and her paper is titled Performance of Survival in the Post-Apocalyptic World, Examining Art and Academia in Emily St. John Mandel's novel, Station 11. So over to you, Indrani.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you to all the organizers. I'm keeping my video switched off because I'm just, working on my personal hotspots. So I hope I can be excused for the same. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. So my paper is titled Performance of Survival in a Post-Apocalyptic World, Examining Art and Academia in Emily St. Mandel's Station 11. The global outbreak of coronavirus and its threat to human existence has forced us to reconsider our normative understanding of the world. If lockdowns, quarantine, health, and safety measures have become a buzzword in our encounter with modernity in the wake of coronavirus, it has also led us to acknowledge the socio-political, economic, medical, and cultural crisis that has arisen in the wake of this disaster. The unprecedented loss of lives and economic meltdowns across the world has made us stop in our tracks to wait in silence, as Emily St. John Mandel stated in her introduction to her award-winning novel, Station 11. Pandemics, epidemics, and evolutionary mutations has, as Lynn Margulis claimed, outlined a new pathway of evolutionary variation. Positioning my paper against this backdrop of variation and where silence is what echoes us in the face of such apocalyptic disaster, Mandel's novel is read in light of what art and academia can offer to the world and to our future after the world as we know it ends. In various pop cultural expressions where such end-of-the-world state of affairs and apocalyptic scenarios are in vogue, like the Maze Runner, Hunger Games, Interstellar, The Last Man on Earth, and the recent Netflix show Sweet Tooth, to name a few, the stories document a world on the brink of environmental or socio-political collapse. In many of these novels, cinematic or televised adaptations, the issue of survival forms the core thematic concern. These dystopian renderings offer heterogeneous representations of post-apocalyptic era where brutality and violence emerge as the normative pattern. The fictional representation of these futuristic worlds are shown as devoid of a moral fabric and where redrawing of the assemblages of human and non-human remains the only way to survive amidst the planetary crisis. Emily St. John Mandel's novel, Station 11, however, refuses to subscribe to a survival logic and underlines that mere existence is not what will enable us to cope with the collapse of all that we are familiar with. To inhabit a post-apocalyptic world, Mandel's novel states it is important to reinvent and refashion such a world by a renewed connection and interaction with art and literature. Mandel's novel, Station 11, published in 2014 and the winner of Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction, is a remarkable work crisscrossing multiple timelines that obliquely refers to planetary entanglements required to grapple with the pandemic. However, more overtly, Mandel's novel necessitates the need to outline the role of art in academia amidst environmental disaster and the decline of socio-political, economic, technological, and the moral fabric of contemporary society. The central question posed by the novel is how and in what ways is art and literature positioned in the wake of a planetary crisis? What meanings and values are enunciated in the realms of literature amidst the destruction of a known, familiar social world? In the novel, the theatrical traveling symphony's motto, survival is not enough, and a similar tagline engraved as a tattoo on the central character, Kirstein's arm, survival is insufficient, points towards a newer delineation of post-apocalyptic renderings. Mandel's novel, in its dramatization of a melee of voices from sentimental to rational, from realistic settings to futuristic landscapes, foregrounds how art, literature provides social currency to lived, embodied social relations. Cultural expressions in Station 11 emerges as a kind of transaction where our memories are evoked, traded, shared, appropriated, and curated. Cultural representations acts as an amulet and a shield for the motley survivors of the Georgia flu pandemic that destroys almost the whole global population. The fulcrum of multiple timelines which crisscross each other draws our attention to, I argue, the presence and vitality of performance. The story begins with Arthur Leander, an aging actor dying on the stage while performing as Shakespeare's King Lear. Even as his death signals the onset of the deadly Georgian flu, which destroys the world and the familiar everyday habits and rituals, Leander's death directs us to see how artistic performance and all its paraphernalia intersects with reality. While the epidemic undercuts the control that the characters have over their lives, with families either being broken up and death looming large, the fact that plastic snow keeps on falling on the stage even after Leander's death, and which coexists with snow falling in the real world, blurs the distinction between real and fiction. Chris Salter writes that the pandemic has generated a sharpened sense of opposition between the orders of real and fictional experiences, while also implicating these realms within each other in complex and contradictory ways. From the very beginning of the novel, Mandel sought to represent how the act of living itself is a performance, and where artistic performance does not merely represent, but also constitutes our realities. Arthur's death remains a pivotal event throughout the novel, with a child actor playing the role of a ghost of one of the daughters of Lear, and who witnesses Arthur's death on stage, turns up 20 years later after the collapse of the known world due to the epidemic as the central character in this novel. This child actor, Kirsten, who 20 years after the pandemic, along with a motley crew, runs a theatrical traveling company which showcases Shakespeare and other musicals across the ravaged settlements of Toronto, along with the cult leader who goes by the name of Prophet, but who is actually the son of Arthur, Tyler, his name is Tyler, and the corporate consultant, Clark, Arthur's friend, who after the epidemic, when the epidemic has destroyed the world, now runs a museum of civilization built on an erstwhile defunct airport. Kirsten, Tyler, Clark, all living in different geographical spaces, carry a copy of a graphic narrative called Dr. Levin, whose first volume is titled Station Levin. Interestingly, this first volume carries the same name as the title of our text, creating, according to Laudius Anchiselis, multiple layers of textual intersection. While these characters have the same version of this graphic novel, they all tend to read it differently. Clark and Kirsten share a penchant for reinventing and reformulating the values of life in a post-apocalyptic setting by the means of curating text and objects of various kinds. If for Kirsten, with a theatrical traveling symphony, survival emerges as closely affiliated with a dose of art and specifically enacting Shakespeare in an ecologically changed world, for Clark, his museum functions as the site to curate old objects as memories from the pre-epidemic world like credit cards, iPhones, smartphones, laptops, and so on, signifying a gesture of remembrance of things we have lost. These curated artifacts function offers an exploration into new readings of the use of trauma, performance, and memory in the dystopian fiction of Mendel. On the other hand, Tyler's understanding of the seed graphic narrative is linked with networks of power. His interpretation of the graphic novel is outlined by his act of abducting a young girl from the theatrical company where Kirsten works, who he believes is ordained to be his future wife. The marriage with this girl, Tyler believes, will increase his power manifold, and he would eventually emerge as the undisputed master of a world ravaged by an epidemic. Tyler, as a self-styled messiah of a doomsday cult, reads the epidemic as a curse from God and the survivors as committed to carry on the message of the divine. His reading of the graphic narrative leads him to invest in power, represented by his cult status and underlined by his actions of killing anyone who refuses to subscribe to his values. While Tyler's aggressive paradigm meets a sorry end, this paper aims to read Kirsten and Clark's artistic maneuvers as the only way to survive in a world where our consciousness of the world has irrevocably been shaken. Carmen M. Nandes Garcia argues that the survival of Shakespeare and other assorted items found in abundant baggage at an airport emphasizes the resilience of cultural objects in a brave new world and seeks to confirm the significance of art and academia in a changed world. Describing Shakespeare and the curated items of the museum as objects, Garcia identifies the idea of culture as being crucial to defining what is human in a changed world. She reads the post-apocalyptic environment as singularly committed to survive in an unimaginable environment. And according to her, this survival requires seed markers of civilization, which is provided by Shakespeare, functioning as the universal signifier of civilization, an ethos that will and should survive. Garcia claims that in the post-epidemic times, when humankind have been reduced to survive on bare essentials, or primitive order, as she claims, Shakespeare functions as a fantasy suggestive of the goodness and decency in human nature, and the possibility of communal creation of little cells of camaraderie, a kind of preservation of the best of culture, society, and previous models of civilization. In a world where internet, technology, pharmaceuticals have all vanished, the remnants and reminder of what humankind imagined and created is now expressed by the singular figure of Shakespeare. Garcia finds the presence of Shakespeare as not only cliched, but also deeply problematic. She claims that the recurring motive of Shakespeare in many post-apocalyptic literary expressions like David Breen's 1985, The Postman, BBC's Desert Island Dicks, and Mendel's novel all perpetuate the idea of a universal Shakespeare, undeniably tied to the notion of Anglophonic survival. Likewise, Philip Smith goes on to exclaim that by reinventing this humanist endeavor, Mendel's novel avoids the problematic representation of Shakespeare in the colonial encounter by presenting a world conveniently free of natives. The towns where the traveling symphony performs are peopled by those who have lost and must regain Western models of civility. While Shakespeare does emerge as a central motif of culture, my understanding of the iconic figure of Shakespeare in this post-endemic world is not outlined as such starkly black and white framework. Even as I partly agree with the perpetuation of a humanity in terms of cultural resilience and as a continuation of Shakespeare as a central motif, my reading of Shakespeare is framed in contradictory terms. I argue that the presence of art or the represencing of Shakespeare in Mendel's novel is neither cast in monolithic idiom nor governed simply by Eurocentric perspectives. Instead, I believe Shakespeare intersects and is intercepted by other cultural objects whose meanings are continually shifting. Shakespeare operates as a text whose values are appropriated or traded with other cultural forms, and even those objects are defined differently. The preeminence of Shakespeare as a cultural icon is shaken up with the presence of a graphic novel, the generic assumptions of a science fiction text, and assorted items collected from abandoned luggage found at an obscure airport, the presence of newspapers, absent photographs, frayed at the edges. The very tagline of the theatrical traveling symphony of Kirsty is borrowed from the popular sci-fi TV series Star Trek. The varying ways in which the same graphic narrative is read points towards a world that is not driven by canonical and hegemonic undertakings. Instead, the very act of reading operates as a kind of performance, and which, as the figure of Arthur in the opening pages of the novel shows, is always mutating, intersecting, and collaborating with other voices and registers. Likewise, the major characters that of Kirstine, Tyler, and Clark, all linked with the figurehead performer Arthur, connect in varying ways in the post-pandemic world. While Tyler and Kirstine face off at the end of the novel to rescue the abducted girl belonging to a theatrical troupe and which eventually leads to the death of Tyler, Clark is aware of Kirstine's performance company via a newspaper article, and after the confrontation with Tyler, Kirstine goes to the deserted airport, now transformed into a museum. Lourdes rightly argues that this novel demonstrates how everyone's actions affects the others, where every subjectivity remains connected with another subject, mirroring the post-pandemic world devoid of borders and boundaries. Here, Miranda, the first wife of Arthur and the author of the said graphic novel, along with other comic book renditions, intersects with embodied constructions and fictional enactments that refuse a parochial understanding of this changed atmosphere. Borrowing from Joanna Freed, I argue that Mendel's novel evokes a world constructed along the lines of haunting encounters, where, to quote Freed, fiction inspires a new and more ethical relationships across boundaries of difference, and which is only possible when readers come into contact with others through the work of the literary imagination. Meetings, encounters, and confrontations in Mendel's text between Kirstine, Tyler, or Clark figures as literary expressions that operate in paradoxical ways. The performance of Shakespeare and a museum built on painstaking skills of curation does not reflect the fixity of meaning and value.
Indrani, you have 5 more minutes.
I will complete it. Thank you. Museum, while an archive that assembles and arranges artifacts as per specific ideology, is nonetheless, as Sharon MacDonald argues, a site that requires moving beyond interdisciplinary concerns to enunciate greater dialogue with others. Museum as an archive, as per Catherine Hales, draws inference from George Louis Borges' story, The Aleph, opines that it is at once part of a cultural imaginary, but also linked with matters transcendental. That is, she says, can we imagine an end to the library without, imagining an end to the universe? Her understanding of an archive draws attention to the role of curators who exercise an apparatus of control. While I agree with the image of the curators as articulating a specific remembrance of the past, Clark's museum is built on a deserted airport and operates as a site of useless trivia. Electronic objects from pre-pandemic era points towards an ambiguous delineation of culture. Here, objects like smartphones and like, while resurrecting its old meanings, is no longer ensconced in consumerist and materialist frameworks. The curated display of objects in this Museum of Civilization appears as a performance similar to Traveling Symphony's rendition of Shakespeare. Even as Clark's controlling design signals a lost world and its attendant values reminds the audience of the fragility of human existence, the museum also in its enunciation of pain and trauma offers a forum where, as Fintan Walsh observes, performers and audiences gather to disappear and reinvent, expand, and extend. Shakespeare in the museum does not function as a fixed stable repository of meanings. Even as stable configurations are evoked, they are immediately undercut by the juxtaposition of such cultural objects with other items. It is not the universal rendition of Shakespeare that is evoked, but an intertextual configuration of values which operates in this changed order. What becomes important in this post-epidemic world is not the object itself, but as Lourdes argues, the creative effort and application of knowledge that went into producing it. With the pandemic destroying public libraries and internets becoming non-functional, Shakespeare and the objects curated in the museum are enlisted to preserve order via memories. In this fragmentary world of meaning and values undergirded by personal memories, the act of living and grappling with a changed world necessitates a theatrical idiom. This idiom is verbalized as collaborative, registering co-creative actions that seek to recuperate the past, but in newer registers. While Tyler's superstitious delusions engraved by his mother, Elizabeth, leads to his death, his philosophical maxims are often underscored as unchangeable and non-negotiable. However, Kirstein and Clark's assertion of culture approximates the movable stage world of the Traveling Symphony. Even as the same graphic novel is read by all characters and the same Shakespearean play are recreated in the post-pandemic world, the meanings and values differ. In this unknown world, Kirstein embarks on new performances even as the old is being staged. Shakespeare intersects with forgotten histories remembered in a hazy way by Kirstein. Kirstein, who operates both as an audience and as an actor, continually explores and navigates the world around her as if for the first time. Here, past and present intercept each other as the word unmoved in the opening pages of the novel call attention to things being uprooted and always in a flux. While Miranda's comic books figure as the most significant treasure trove for Kirstein in the post-pandemic age, it is because literature allows her to connect more directly with people she has known, to lived lives to which she can relate. Shakespeare, the museum are not dead objects, but figure as mechanism to make sense of an alien world that is being operated on by our memories and reworked by our embodied experiences. Art emerges as a junction where specific meanings collate and collide while others remain in the background. It is forever in making, like Kirstein states to Clark. When we come back through, I will take this one back and leave you with the other one. That way, at least one book will be safe. Art in Station 11 is being made and remade, appearing as a negotiable terrain, outlining moral, individual, and communal choices necessary to recover from crisis by practicing and conserving culture. Thank you. Just give me a second. Yeah, I will just switch on my video now.
Yeah, thank you, Indrani, for that well-researched, well-articulated, stimulating paper. And I think people are still mulling over the ideas that you have presented. Meanwhile, I just want to engage with this idea of pandemic writing and performance, as well as, how or what are the ways in which we sort of build effective interventions in grappling with pandemic through literary writing or cinema or for art. And I have a reason as to why I'm asking you this, because somewhere I feel that, I don't know whether writers or filmmakers are able to create that interface between the reader and the audience while depicting something as gruesome as pandemic. I really don't know, because somewhere, there are these silences. There are a lot of people who are not talking about the pandemic, who don't want to engage with the pandemic. And there are deliberate silences. And on the other hand, we have literary texts and films that are widely discussing about the pandemic. So between these two narratives, what kind of effective interventions do literary texts evoke, especially in writing a text or rereading a text, like for instance, the novel that you have talked about, you have discussed in your paper was sort of, as well as Albert Camus' play was, these two texts were very popular during the lockdown, sort of. So, and what about those people who don't have sort of access to this kind of literature or art, and how do they find a cathartic, outlet?
Yeah, thank you, Grace. Thank you for this question. So the first thing that, needs to be kept in mind when I discuss this novel by Mendel, Station 11, she does not discuss absolutely the aftermath of the pandemic. She, recreates the pandemic era after 20 years. So she starts out by explaining that the pandemic has now softened out. Its edges are now frayed, in the sense that, instead of brutality and violence, what now comes in its wake is a sort of an understanding that, somehow, comforts us that, the things which were worse that have now come to an end. So what do we do now? So instead of speaking about survival, because which is what you will find in, texts like, Netflix shows Sweet Tooth and all, which is more about survival. How do you grapple with the idea of a collapse of a known familiar world? This one comes with, when the known familiar world is already dead and gone, what do we do with it? Mere survival is not, sufficient enough. So what do we do? And there comes, the notion of, bringing in, renewing our contact with art and literature. Here, Shakespeare does not simply function as, sort of an icon, icon of the Western world and so on, but Shakespeare is a sort of a familiar father figure. Like King Lear, starts the play itself, kind of a, play the father who had, somehow forsaken his daughters and abandoned them. It's the father which is now coming to haunt back here. This father, on the other hand, is also willing to engage with the sons and the daughters that now comes in this new world. So you have the graphic and you have, and the graphic narrative is being read by different readers. And also, please remember, this is a traveling symphony. They're going from places to places. Even those places might be, located in and around, North America. The fact is, the audiences come from everywhere. They're coming from across the world. How they're coming, we don't know. Maybe because of the changed atmosphere, whatever it is. As well, also for the museum. The museum is a deserted airport. It was once an airport. It is now no longer an airport. So here also people do walk in and they walk out. There is no entry fee or anything at all. They just go and see supposedly a smartphone and they just handle, and then they feel, okay, this was what we had made once upon a time. 20 years before, this was, part of a human imaginary. So somehow there is a recreation of who we were, but without taking in those old meanings. So what happens when, people are coming and meeting, so on? The affective intervention is one which is, of constant co-creation. It's a co-participation culture that is being brought about here. Theater itself is a collaborative juncture between the audience and the performers and, the producers and the writers who are writing about it. And Station 11, the word station itself tells you that, there are many trains coming and going here. And this is it's a sort of a junction where, when people come and go, they will tell different stories. So as John Berger once said, if you can tell different stories to different people, I'm sure you will be able to create a new world. So maybe this is how you can, somehow grapple with the dynamics of this new world and create, more affective, dimensionalities. The affective dimensionalities, as, Garcia Mendez said, that they were all of the old. They were telling the same old stories. I definitely do not think of it that they are telling the same story. When you have, the interception of, using the motto from a Star Trek series, which is a contemporary, sort of a contemporary show, and you are using graphic narrative, which of course debunks with, the visuality and the verbality of any narrative gestures and registers. The fact is, we are definitely using and cross-cutting many, many genres and many forms of telling those stories. So stories itself will allow us to, rephrase ourselves in a new manner, in a new signification. I hope so. I explained.
Yeah, thank you for that response, Indrani. And since I think people would gradually engage with your paper, they need some time. So
Yeah,
we'll quickly...
they have sent in some questions.
Asha,
Sure,
okay,
sure.
fine. Yeah, please, quickly.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting presentation, and I've noticed that we are getting a couple of questions based on the idea of memory as mentioned in your presentation. So I'll combine them and ask you, how do you analyze the role of memory as a means of performance of survival, especially during the times of pandemic or even a post-pandemic world?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this question. So there is a, particular stage where, Kirsten comes across a photograph which is not there. There's only a part of it, or just a little bit of part of it is there. And from this part, she believes, this is a person that I had known, probably, this is Arthur, who was, sort of a father figure to her, the actor Arthur. And when she, sees the photographs, she immediately starts writing few notes here and there to the Shakespearean text that she was trying to, perform for the next day. And when she's writing those notes are as much as they are immediate and personal. The fact is they are also nostalgic because she is reminded of a person she had already known and whom she once considered as a sort of a father-like figure. This, remembrance of things that she had known and the things that she is now reinventing and, sort of, refashioning allows her to grapple with the changed world where maybe the pharmaceuticals, the electricity, the internet is no longer there. It's an absolutely changed world. What do you do in a changed world? The first thing that you try to do is to try to remember who you were and why you were. And maybe those absent photographs, the fact that it's absent, and yet she is thinking of certain things that were out there, which is of course hazy and blurred because 20 years have elapsed since that date. But nevertheless, those remembrance and her own reinvention and remaking of those stories allows her to grapple with this present day. That is the post-pandemic era. I hope so I explained.
Thank you, Indrani.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, Arisha.
yeah. So now we move to the third and the final presenter, Soumyabrata Maity. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Soumyabrata Maity is a PhD scholar at the Department of English, University of Delhi. The paper is titled as Globalization, Pandemic, and Plague Poetics, Mary Shelley's The Last Man and Albert Camus' The Plague. Over to you, Soumyabrata. Please switch on your cameras. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, good afternoon to all, to you all. So, this study attempts to understand how Mary Shelley's novel *The Last Man* and Camus' *The Plague*, with the portrayal of a fatal fictional epidemic or pandemic, challenge and undermine post-revolutionary English as well as the post-Second World War French Algerian social, moral, religious, and political beliefs and values. So, to discuss etiology or etymology of plague a bit, the English word plague comes from the Latin word plaga, meaning to strike or wound, and plague in Latin is pestis or pestilentia, from which comes the word pestilence. Ancient Greek source mentions plague as both plague or loimos, among others. So plague is the oldest. Just let me. So it is the oldest recorded name of all epidemic diseases. From the very beginning, one noted thing is plague has been associated with touch, gaze, motion, and dissemination. Within the lexicon of disease, tuberculosis or syphilis or even yellow fever and cholera are often labeled as plague. If you look at the plays of Shakespeare, you'll notice that how many times Shakespeare utters the word plague as metaphor. Okay, even scurvy. So the relationship between plague and social disorder, as hypothesized by the noted French historian René Girard in his Plague in Literature and Myth, where demonstrates how plague is always accompanied by fourfold social cluster: epidemic contagion, the dissolving of differences, mimetic bubbles, and sacrificial elements. As plague threatens the unity of social bond and forces, containment on the mass, plague has more social and political role to play. A proper examination of a disease narrative needs a deeper understanding of the history of the disease, history of the medicalized body, history of the disease or Sikh society, and history of the social context of those medicalized bodies, history of the disease circulation across geographies. In a seminal study, Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag links personal feelings of disease with the societal or worldly aspect of it. She notes that feelings about evils are projected onto a disease, and the disease is projected onto the world. So it's really intriguing to note how the personal history of disease is intertwined with the national as well as natural and global aspects of disease or pandemic disease. So here I need to skip a bit. Here is a bit about the national global aspect of it. However, a person directly or indirectly gets infected as a result of the government policy of war, economics, imperialism, despotism, slave trade, etc. This is how a national or official body interpels individual or Sikh bodies, and Sikh individual body unknowingly becomes the nation's subject, to draw on Althusserian mode, a nation subject, subject to be controlled or to be ordered. So, and now to discuss these two texts within 1 or 2 minutes. So Shelley's Last Man, an uncannily prophetic novel, is about a bubonic plague that wipes out the entire human race with the exception of the narrator Lionel Verney. Shelley had in her mind lessons of anatomy and disease while writing the novel, and contemporary magazines like the Monthly Review and the Blackhead magazine criticized it for its concern with human body, physiology, and disease, especially for its making the diseased human frame quote unquote bare to the public eye. So normal public eyes was not accustomed with the medicalized disease bodies of the patient. And the Monthly Review writes about the novel. The discrimination of the operations of the pestilence are particularly objectionable for their minuteness. It is not a picture which she gives us, but a lecture in anatomy, in which every part of the human frame is laid bare to the eye. They are saying about who has become a literary celebrity with the publication of Frankenstein at the age of 18, the wife of Shelley and the daughter of Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. So this is how the common society is treating a narrative about disease. Okay, so in truest sense, since The Last Man is a modern piece of writing and radical in tone, since it goes beyond the popular tropes of 18th century and early 19th century novels, since it was against the popular tradition of writing novels about virtue, vice, sentiment, or sensibility, haunted houses, or gothic novels, family, money, marriage, and sex. So, and as far as my limited understanding goes, Last Man is the first English novel to evolve completely around a pandemic disease. Disease was always there, in Shakespeare, in Decameron, but they act as a backdrop in a fictional world. But here in this world, in Last Man, disease, death, and pandemic are the main protagonists, against which politics of imperialism and ambivalent colonial relation between the East and the West are negotiated and problematized. So Shelley's choices of the two cities, Constantinople and Athens, is very significant, for these are one of the two ancient cities deeply associated with the disease of plague. So the disease of plague in Last Man has its origin in Constantinople and then spread to Greece, Europe, America, England, and to the whole world. And plague seems to be generated through the imposition of cultural ideals, significant at Constantinople on the boundary of Europe and Asia, where Greek idealism, politics of imperialism, or English militarism join part. See, this in this novel, the character Lord Raymond is also modeled on the romantic hero or Byronic hero. Byron also, died at the battle at Misoglione. Sorry, not in battle, in a siege of fever. So, and yeah, Lionel Vardy, the narrator, the sole survivor of the novel, writes the history of the last man in Rome, undertakes the visionary task of writing the decline and fall of British Empire. modeling of or Edward Gibbon. The novel reflects on the significant role empire has played in the global spread of disease. And however, these two novels, I think I need to skip Camus' portion here. However, there are if you think in terms of the narrative structure, these two novels are viewed from a victim's perspective, Last Man, and Camus' Plague is viewed from a doctor's perspective. Okay, so but both Shelley and Camus' aims were to depict not the endism of British Empire or the city of Odin, but also to project how a pandemic disease has been an inseparable and inevitable part of 18th, 19th, and 20th century Western enterprise of travel, expansion, capitalism, and the crisis of modernism. So global circulation of pandemic disease as well as the materials of the diseases exercise a shaping force on the history of imperial as well as modern imagination, history of book circulation, also history of circulation of knowledge or the idea circulation, and the ideas and the history of science and medical science. So I will come back to this at the conclusion. Okay, now to discuss a bit about the narrative and the plague poetics. One of the most plague texts they are birthed in the factual realities, and therefore, in order to understand the aesthetics of plague literature, one needs to examine the transformative process from the factual reality to the literary reality. How the author reaches at the final stages of writing through observation, perception, and experience. The journey from the perception towards the representational is very significant, since this journey is not one-dimensional. One-dimensional. It is a two-way road. Like Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year and Shelley's Last Man, Camus' Plague portrays the factual realities from the temporal frame of the present. But they're remarkable in that they engage themselves with the representational mode of co-presenting past, present, and future. Both these novels are allegories of pestilence-stricken civilization on the wake of geographical expansion, as I mentioned already, colonization and massive travel and imperial war. The narrator of the Camus' Plague, Dr. Ryu, depicts the diseased city of Oran with the scientific details, day-to-day minute statistics of daily fatalities, such as just as Defoe's narrator of the Journal of the Plague Year portrays in minute details of the plague-ridden city of London. Both the narrator engage with the social realities in the form of flesh and blood, with an eye to heighten the images, the illusion of reality. So, and as I mentioned, plague has also been identified, has long been identified as a disease of contact and communication. One thing is common in all plague texts: the textuality of plague resists every possibility of logic, rationality, and certainty or fixity of meaning. It believes in dissemination and contamination, since it is uncontrollable by any border, race, and nationality. Drawing on Derrida's postulations that metaphoricity is the logic of contamination and the contamination of logic, we can assert that metaphor is based on the logic of dissemination that infects and deconstructs the stability of definition. In plague or disease narratives, there is no ultimate signifier, since there are constant discussions on and reference to medicalized bodies, states, and afterlives. The most unique thing in both Last Man and Plague are the philosophical meditations on worldly journey beyond the end of the world, a meta-worldly appropriation of the decayed and diseased map of the world. So description of the plague in scientific detail in plague literature is very common, but the translation of the plague reality to novelistic reality is not only scientific or medical, but also poetic and metaphorical. But just as virus or bacillus of plague mutates constantly to escape the serum that would destroy it, so is the poetics of the plague literature, constantly addressing to the new challenges and nuances of crisis, faith, and modernism. Considering the ever-challenging reality of plague narrative, we can conclude this section with our acknowledgement that the aesthetic or the plague aesthetic shapes and the metaphor is constantly reshaped. Just 1 second. So the next section is historiography, memory, and post-apocalyptic body. I think I can skip this portion here. I'm mainly drawing on Ilana Gomel's article, The Plague of Utopias, and and Mois Blanchot's The Writing of the Disaster. I have discussed the logic of repetitions, memory, and yeah, I can read this. How Glomel identifies several kinds of plague narratives but the first type of plague narrative as identified by Glomel and are narrated in science fiction mode, set in the future, and they express orientation towards the cleansing of the society through disease in order to facilitate a glorious rebirth, quote unquote. And the second category, the post-apocalyptic fiction normally deals with the afterlives, aftermonths, and reminders. So post-apocalypse doesn't concern with the present moment of death. Time is a significant factor in post-apocalypse since it concerns with the perpetual and endless span of time. Since and hence post-apocalyptic writing has problematic relationship with time's backward movement, memorization, distortion, traumatic recuperations, and violence. And coming to the end of Last Man, all alone at the end, Barney in Last Man searches for a fellow creature, though in vain. He goes to Rome and spends a year in writing and meditating on future. With no one arrives after Barney's long wait, finally climbs St. Peter's and inscribes on stone, I quote, the year 21,000, the last year of the world. You know, the Last Man is set in actually 2074. Then, accompanied only by his dog, he embarks for unknown source. The narrative of plague and post-apocalypse depends heavily on the art of repetition, repeated portrayal of the disease symptoms, decay, body, and death. So, all disease narratives either draw on the first-hand or direct experience of the narrator, or on the memorization of the narrator of what he or she had seen or heard in the past. So, hence, personal memory as well as cultural memory plays a vital role in disease narratives. Jennifer Cook in a study beautifully notes that, I quote, what remains important is plague's position with cultural memory what remains important is plague's position within cultural memory and its popular, artistic, and theoretical representations. So cultural memory, as indicated in the above quotation, plays a pivotal role in the circulation of imagery and impression of the plague through generations. In his essay titled Collective Memory and Cultural Identity, John Asma formulates that the human beings have to find an implement to maintain the nature over generations, and the cultural memory can indeed serve as such an implement. It is the concept of saving knowledge.
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay. That directs behavior and experience in social context that lasts over generation. In post-apocalyptic, degenerated world of post-disease and ongoing death, with its lone survivals planning to voyage through the world, cultural memories of disease plague bodies serve as the implement of the justly extinct human race, which will invisibly travel and transcend via the proposed map of the borderless world. So for this purpose, the Barney and Dr. Ryu memorize and works on all that survives time's ravages. Barney's meditation and preparation for a journey beyond the known world of shores and desert is mythical. In his large journey with his lone companion dog, to my Puranic imagination, I can say, Barney strongly resembles the Mahabharata character Yudhishthir's last journey to heaven with his dog, witnessing all variety of appearance, quote unquote. And Dr. Ryu, at the end of the novel, also Camus Plague, also believed that his chronicle should, I quote, be a witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, and to state quite simply what we learned in a time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in man than to despise. So who are these narrators, Lionel Dowden, Barney, or the Dr. Ryu? So Barney at the end of the novel, Last Man says, I quote, after a long interval, I'm again impelled by the restless spirit within me to continue my narration, this journal of death, the long drawn and torturous path leading to the ocean of countless tears awakens me again to keen grief. I had used this history as an opiate. There is an emphasis, history as an opiate. So this is quite noteworthy, as Salim Sinai in Midnight Children pickled his memory as well as his autobiography While narrating personal as well as national history, Bharani, the main narrator of The Last Man, uses the history as of mankind as an opiate. So, and he also mentioned few books which he describes to feed his appetite for craving, and these are the accounts of Boccaccio, Defoe, and Brown, and authors who describe in detail voiceless solitude of one's busy earth, and also the lonely state of disease, plague, and death. Okay, I'm skipping one portion. So dissemination. So Bharani at the end wants a story of disease and suffering and apocalypse to traverse the whole world beyond the western center of marginalized to the marginalized island of the Indian Ocean. He finds this apparently significant line from the I find this apparently significant line from the last paragraph of the novel extremely magical. The library of the world is thrown to me, and in any port I can renew my stock. So dissemination of worldly knowledge and wisdom oscillates between being thrown open of the past and of being renewed by the future. He moves past the physical appearance of time. The monotonous present seems intolerable to him. Like the greatest philosopher of the world, he can now see past, present, and future together within the heart of time. I quote, I shall witness all variety of appearance that the elements can assume. Reaches at the end of the reaches all this wisdom and philosophy of time, disease, and death, much before the end of the novel, amidst the plague, war, and pandemic, which is fundamental foreseeing the pestilence had become a part of our future. Or the old man at the very end of Camus' novel, I quote, but what does that mean? Plague, just life, no more than that. I can have 2 more minutes, just my conclusion. Okay.
Have 1 more minute, yeah.
Just please give me 2 more minutes. Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah. So, The Last Man and Plague examines a question that was central in the colonial period as well as in post-modern or post-war period, and that is of becoming a paramount importance in the contemporary world as one looks at political states struggling to survive in the face of epidemic rise of disease. And the question is, how well can a state or nation respond to a massive rise of disease when its resources are limited? With vast regions of the globe are currently undergoing epidemiological crisis beyond imaginings and health being a global problem, this paper surmises about its paramount importance in the contemporary world as one looks at political state struggles to survive in the face of borderless epidemic. So it is extremely striking to note how the narrators of both these narratives move beyond the quest of reality and how they experimented on certain forms of knowledge. According to metaphysical realism, the objects exist independently beyond the participants of the observers, and it is fundamental in all scientific examinations. But the medical explorers here in these novels are active participant and observant of the subjects. The medical epistemology or aesthetics which the narrators achieved in these novels are not laboratory or microscope-centric fixed knowledge. Rather, it is a form of intuitive or perceptive knowledge based on the health restorative ethics of care and healing medicine or exploratory medicine. The medical epistemologies are certain forms of historical sociology and social anthropology. However, more than the social or cultural anthropology, these forms or tropes are deeply concerned with the medical anthropology. Medical anthropology is the interdisciplinary field that concerns itself with the body, health, disease, epidemic biology, and the experience and observations of the exploring physicians and the writers. We discussed patent to the nuanced ideas of environment, traveling ecology, pandemic disease, outbreak, contagion, miasma, medical topography, and all. So embodied truth of pre-romantic and romantic age science or modern or or post-modern philosophy. I have skipped the Victorian age for some certain reason because there is a fixed category which is known as germ theory or scientific medicine. I have only focused on the exploratory aspect or observatory aspect of medicine, which comes through knowledge, experience, the positive knowledge. So the embodied truth of pre-romantic or romantic age science or modern or postmodern philosophy is often challenged and reshaped by participatory experiences as well as the experimentations. So we can think about the positive knowledge. I think or a posteriori knowledge which comes through experience, thanks to the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte, Emile Durkheim, or the philosophy of death and absurdity, which comes from Mary Shelley. Or in a romantic time, you can look at the writings of Wordsworth, Edward Jenner, okay, Thomas De Quincey.
You
So
know,
via just few more seconds. Okay, so via Schopenhauer and Nietzsche to the now to Albert Camus. You can think also about the myth of Sisyphus, the very first line of Absurdity and Suicide. So, like anthropological researchers, these medical explorers in these narratives, as well as in any pandemic world, as both participant, observant, and as well as observatory participants. And in most cases, rather than individual examination, the anthropologists generally study a group or cultural community. So, in
Soumyabrata,
so some
maybe we can,
yeah.
Sort of engage further with your paper in the Q&A round.
Just one or two last line. So the notion of exploratory medicine, which is my term, is more about the methods and process and paths of discovery rather than the final discovery. The evidence and certainty or fixed conclusion is beyond the foray of exploratory or ethnographic or spiritual medicine of the romantic era or the era between modernism and postmodernism. The method of probability and possibility is the chief criterion of the romantic era or the modern exploratory science. Medicine, with its medical ethics of humanitarian care and healing towards the disease, with its focus on the care, affect healing, and faith healing or spiritual healing, the poetics of exploratory medicine thus can even address the issues of remodernism or postmodernism. So, okay, I choose to stop. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Soumyabrata, for that incisively researched and comprehensive paper presentation. And so I don't have a question per se, but I have some ideas and I believe that what Camus was trying to say through the plague was this idea that human civilization is always and always susceptible to various kinds of pestilences, as long as they are being incubated by different kinds of power structures. So in this context, I believe, especially in South Asia, the impact of the pandemic continues to be continues to be seen in various aspects, especially the fear of the other, the fear of touch, the fear of the contagion, the fear of the unknown, that has widened and it has become very prominent. So in that sense, I'm still trying to understand that what kind of a post-pandemic world we have entered into, and is there a going back to the old world? Because for some reason it is not possible. For other, the old is lost, and going back to it is also a sort of luxury. So it is also difficult terrain to reclaim it. So this is the thought that I gathered after your paper presentation. And there's a question for you. It's an interesting question in the chat box, and Arisha will take you through that.
Yes, so I'll just read out the question by Rana Vagela. As you talked about Camus' The Plague, how do you look at his metaphorical lines? And I quote, "The plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms,
Okay,
cellars."
I got the line. This is the very last line of the novel.
So the question is, in the context with the arrival of COVID-19, please explain it in the context with social plague, which you have quoted from René Girard. And how do you look at the role of biopower and biopolitics during pandemic in reference to Oran government in Camus' The Plague and government during COVID-19?
Okay, to begin with the first question, actually, this is the interesting. Actually, this quotation is also in my text. I have skipped. This is a very last line of Camus' Plague. So this already I have hinted in the paper that with which I ends. Would there be any culture of post-pandemism? Because as far as my understanding goes, there won't be such a culture, because post-pandemism, because as Mary Shelley or Camus opines or theorizes that pandemic is an ever happening reality. There is no post culture because it's disease and pandemic. It is always there in our civilization, and that is why Camus says that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chest. That is why I have focused on the aspects of afterlives and cultural memory. And here is the role of memorization. You know, in the time of isolations, when there is no connection. But most of the times we spoke about phone, so connection. So through our memorization, we could connect. So yeah, that is what Camus' message is, or sorry, Shelley's message is, that pestilence had become a part of our future. To note this two words, had and future. Okay. So this is also Camus' message at the very end, that it only disappears for the time being, for the present, but it is an ever present reality, and we need to approach it with a positive philosophy. That is why I mentioned Auguste Comte, positive philosophy, knowledge which comes through experience. Okay. And what is the last question? Oh yeah, biopower. Biopower. Yeah, I will think on this. Just I was thinking about Foucault, because if you look at the Foucault's works, Civilization, Madness, and Order of Things, he pointed towards a birth of a new discipline. This is the biopower in 18th century. But he actually criticizes this biopower. He says that the biopower is an instrument of governmentality and control. How a government hails or the sick bodies or marginalized bodies. In the two novels, you also see the same thing. How an individual body becomes a national body. How imperceptibly he or she becomes a part of a grand or official scheme of things. Thank you for the questions. I'll think about this. And to respond to what is her name, Grace. Who's moderating the chair? Grace Singh. Grace.
Yes.
Yeah, she's not here.
Yeah.
She's here.
Yeah. But you were saying the last words. I just want to draw on this, because did you notice that, and all the speakers and participants present here, how many times my previous speakers, even Choudhury shared, they mentioned this term connection and epic studies and care and healing. So last December, Jamia organized another seminar on the epic studies, planetary and epic studies, and Stephen was also there. So this is how I see this conference as a sequel to this epic studies. In the new millennium or postmodern world, in the one of the basic aspects of the postmodernism, although I do not approve of this term, one of the main things is epic care and the healing or faith healing. Some of my friends is working on the faith healing. So this is how we can connect also from one conference and stretching our conversation. Okay, and thank you all.
Yes, interesting thought to sort of end this conversation. But, it doesn't end here. We only take it further. And I'm sure the other sessions are going to be equally promising and enriching. Thank you, all the presenters, for this wonderful, intellectually stimulating session that we had. The papers were brilliant. And, we now break for the lunch. Please join us back for our next session. And I request all the paper presenters to kindly switch on their cameras for a few seconds so that we could take a picture with all of you. And that'll be it.
Indrani, are you here?
Vikram? Yeah, thank you, Vikram. And Indrani, if you can switch on your camera for just a few seconds.
I don't think. Oh, she's here. Oh, Simi ma'am is also here. So in any case,
When I switch off my camera, I don't think I was called for, so I should switch off my camera.
No, it's good that you've come. In fact, Sudipta had come and she switched off. So in any case, we'll be logging in at 3:15 now. We'll start the Zoom call at 3:15, but the session starts at 3:30. So now we are breaking for lunch, and then see you all soon for the next session.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Indrani is here. We'll just click the picture.
Yeah,
Indrani.
Under which planet, Indrani?
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And thank you, Grace and Arisha, for chairing the session and being a great rapporteur for the session.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Simi ma'am, for this wonderful opportunity. It's always great.
Right. The opportunity is all ours. It's so wonderful to watch you and Arisha and everybody actually. So
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, it was really privileged.
Thank you, Vikram. It was a very interesting paper. I mean,
true, fantastic. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, hello, Simi Malhotra.
Hi,
Vikram. I actually used some of your paper from the Indian Ocean Studies, the book, the new one from Dilip and so forth. Nice to meet you online.
Right. Nice to meet you too. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. So I was so happy and looking forward to connecting further, maybe. Yeah.
Absolutely. Vikram. Fantastic. Great. It was a fantastic paper. Loved it. Yeah. Bye-bye.